Before we go any further into Springfield, before we descend into the specific mysteries and theories that the show has been accumulating for 36 years, it is worth spending a moment with the basic strangeness of the premise itself. The Simpsons has been running since December of 1989. Every person who watched the first episode is now a person who was watching television in 1989, which is to say a person who is now in their 40s, 50s, or older, depending on how old they were when they first watched. The show has outlasted the careers of most television shows, most networks that aired those shows, most cultural moments that seemed permanent when they occurred. The Simpsons has been on while the Soviet Union ended, while the internet was born and grew and transformed the world, while the 20th century gave way to the 21st, and the 21st continued into its third decade. And throughout all of this, Bart Simpson has been 10. Not 10 in the sense of a character fixed at a particular age in a particular moment, the way characters in books are fixed, the way Miss Havisham is fixed at the moment of her jilting, or Jay Gatsby is fixed in the amber of his aspiration. Bart is 10 in the active present tense current moment sense. He is 10 now. He is 10 when you watch the episode that aired last Sunday. He is 10 when you watch the episode that aired in 1992. He is 10 in every possible present tense that the word now can occupy. This is the floating timeline. And it is the strangest thing about the show if you let yourself look at it directly instead of accepting it as the convention that animated television has taught you it is. The show's fictional universe contains a calendar. Episodes are set in recognizable seasons. Christmas episodes happen in December. Halloween episodes happen in October. The characters celebrate birthdays. The world the show depicts advances chronologically, responding to current events and technological changes and cultural shifts with the real-time responsiveness of a show that is always set in the present. And yet the calendar never adds up for these specific people. The years pass outside the show. The years do not pass inside it. Springfield exists in a kind of temporal isolation where time touches everything except the core fact of who these people are and how old they are and what stage of life they occupy. This would be simply a production convention, the kind of thing you accept as the price of entry into animated television, except for the fact that the show has been running long enough for the distance between the convention and the natural expectations of the format to become philosophically significant rather than merely practical. When a show runs for 3 seasons and its characters do not age, you accept it as a convention. When a show runs for 36 seasons and its characters do not age, you are looking at something that has been maintained with considerable deliberate effort across a span of time in which the actual aging of actual people has become a visible and undeniable fact of the audience's experience. The people watching the show have aged. Their children, some of them, are now older than Bart Simpson. Their parents, some of them, have died in the intervening years. And Bart is still 10. The gap between the aging of the audience and the non-aging of the show has become, over 36 years, one of the most sustained and unusual relationships between a cultural artifact and its audience that has ever existed. The show is a mirror that does not update. It shows you the same family it showed you when you first encountered it. And every time you look into it, you measure yourself against the family. And the family does not move. And the measurement tells you something about how much you have changed. This is what we are going into tonight. Not just the individual theories about why nobody ages, or what the contamination does, or who was in that parking lot in the summer of 1995. We are going into the full strangeness of Springfield, the strangeness that accumulates when you take all the individual unusual things about the show and consider them together rather than in isolation. The show has been hiding something in plain sight for 36 years. The hiding is so thorough that most of the audience has accepted the thing being hidden as simply the texture of the show, the way things are around here, not requiring examination because it has been present for so long that it no longer presents itself as something that requires examination. Tonight we examine it. Tonight we pull the thread. Tonight we look at what the show has been telling us every episode for 36 years. In the space just below the jokes and the couch gags and the familiar voices, in the patterns that emerge only when you step back far enough to see all the seasons together rather than episode by episode. What we find there is worth the looking. Let's go. Section 1. The nuclear contamination theory. Get comfortable. Find your position. Let your shoulders drop. Because for the next little while, we are going to Springfield. Not the Springfield you think you know. Not the one full of cartoon gags and couch jokes and Homer stumbling through the front door at 5:30. We are going to the Springfield underneath that one. The one that has been hiding in plain sight for 36 years, tucked just beneath the surface of every single episode, patient and quiet, waiting for someone to slow down long enough to actually look at it. And the best place to start, the one theory that threads through everything else we are going to talk about tonight, is also the most obvious one. So obvious that the show has been screaming it at you since 1989, and somehow almost nobody has taken it seriously. The Springfield nuclear power plant is poisoning the entire town. Not as a metaphor. Not as background scenery. Literally, physically, biologically poisoning every single person who lives in Springfield, has ever lived in Springfield, or has spent enough time inside its borders to drink the water or breathe the air. Let that sit for a moment. Let it settle in the way a good theory does. Slowly and with that particular feeling of things clicking into place. Now let me walk you through it. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the oldest and wealthiest man in town. It is the primary source of electrical power for the entire community, which means every light, every appliance, every television set in Springfield runs on energy generated by that facility. The town is not just near the plant. The town is dependent on it. The plant is Springfield's heartbeat, and the plant is broken in ways that should terrify anyone who stops to think about it. A surprise safety inspection conducted at the facility found 342 violations. 342 separate ways that the plant was operating outside the boundaries of safe, legal nuclear energy production. The estimated cost to bring the facility up to code was $56 million. Burns, a billionaire many times over, refused to spend it. His reasoning, as the show presents it, is not poverty. He has more than enough money. His reasoning is something quieter and considerably more sinister. Fixing the violations would require admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would invite questions about what those violations had already done to the people living downwind of the facility. So he left them, all 342 of them, untouched, leaking, radiating, accumulating. And the violations themselves are not minor. We are not talking about paperwork issues or improperly labeled storage containers. We are talking about radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive material being deposited onto children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's desk, casually, the way you might use a stapler or a coffee mug. Cooling towers with visible cracks patched using chewing gum. Actual chewing gum as structural maintenance on a nuclear reactor. Luminous rats running through the facility's lower levels, their bodies glowing faintly in the dark because they have absorbed enough radioactive material to produce visible light. And then there is the detail the show drops in passing and never returns to. Human skeletons in the basement. Not one. Not a few. Skeletons, plural, in the basement of an active nuclear power facility. The show shows you the bones. A character glances at them. The scene moves on. Nobody asks who those people were or how they ended up there or whether their deaths were in any way connected to the industrial nightmare happening above them. The skeletons are presented and then forgotten, the way everything uncomfortable in Springfield is presented and then forgotten. Now consider who is responsible for preventing all of this from becoming worse. The man whose job it is to stand between the plant's radioactive output and the people of Springfield, the safety inspector. The person the facility employs specifically to ensure compliance with federal standards and prevent contamination from spreading into the surrounding community. That man is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, whose IQ the show's own creator has stated is 55. Homer Simpson, who in one of the series' most famous episodes is discovered to have had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, a physical object sitting inside his skull that has been mechanically reducing his cognitive function for decades. Homer Simpson, who has been documented sleeping at his workstation during active reactor operations, who has eaten donuts during meltdown warnings, who once, in a moment that the show plays as comedy but which is genuinely difficult to process, threw a donut into the reactor core to see if it would grow larger. That is the man standing between Springfield and nuclear catastrophe. That is the human being whose professional judgment is the last line of defense for thousands of people. And he has been failing at that job for over 3 decades. The first visible evidence of what the plant is doing to the surrounding environment appears in Season 2. A fish is pulled from a river near the power plant. The fish has 3 eyes. Not a minor mutation, not a small abnormality. A complete extra eye, fully formed and functional, growing from the side of its head because something in the water it has been swimming in for its entire life rewrote the biological instructions that govern how a vertebrate animal develops. The three-eyed fish named Blinky becomes a news story. A politician running for governor uses Blinky as campaign evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate its harmlessness. He sits at a table in front of cameras, cuts into the fish, brings a piece of it to his lips, and chews. The town watches. The town processes what it has just seen. And then the town shrugs, finds something else to think about, and moves on. Nobody conducts a follow-up study. Nobody tests the water. Nobody from the state or federal government arrives to investigate why a fish from a Springfield river has grown a third eye. And nobody, in what is perhaps the most revealing detail of all, nobody asks the single most obvious question that Blinky raises. If the fish are mutating, what is happening to the people who drink the same water? The answer has been visible since Season 8. In an episode called The Springfield Files, Homer sees something in the woods near town. He describes it as an alien, an extraterrestrial being, humanoid in shape, glowing with a faint green light, moving through the trees in a dazed and ethereal manner. The whole town reacts to his claim. Federal investigators are called in. Mulder and Scully from the X-Files arrive in Springfield to assess the situation. The episode builds to a dramatic revelation about what Homer actually saw in those woods. And the answer is Mr. Burns. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment, a regimen so extreme and so chemically intensive that when he emerges from it, his body emits a visible green glow. The treatments keep him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without them, he dies. His body requires this intervention the way a normal human body requires food and water. And after each session, the chemical load and the radiation exposure leaves him in a dazed, euphoric, barely coherent state, wandering through the woods near the facility like something from another world. He literally glows in the dark. And when Springfield's residents see this glowing, staggering figure moving through the trees, their minds reach not for the obvious explanation, the nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, the facility that has been dumping radioactive material into their water supply for decades, but for the impossible one, an alien visitor from outer space. That is how thoroughly the town's capacity for critical reasoning has been compromised. The most logical explanation for a glowing human figure in a town adjacent to a leaking nuclear reactor is the arrival of beings from another galaxy. The power plant, the obvious source, does not even make the list of candidates. And then there is the Simpsons movie. The film, which operates as a canonical extension of the show's universe, depicts Springfield's environmental contamination reaching a point so catastrophic that the Environmental Protection Agency, an actual federal agency operating within the show's reality, determines that the town must be physically sealed to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. A massive glass dome is lowered over Springfield, containing the town and everyone inside it. The United States government looks at Springfield and concludes that the correct response is not cleanup, not investigation, not remediation. The correct response is containment. Springfield is classified as an environmental hazard. The entire town, every building, every street, every resident. The people who have been drinking that water and breathing that air and living in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers are sealed inside their contamination zone because the government has determined that letting them out would spread whatever Springfield has to the rest of the nation. Now look at the residents themselves. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that does not align with normal human anatomy. His eyes protrude from his face in a way that suggests pressure behind the orbital socket. He has 4 fingers on each hand rather than 5. His IQ, as established by the show's own canon, qualifies as a clinical disability, and his body processes physical trauma in a way that no human biology can account for. He has been shot. He has been electrocuted. He has fallen from cliffs, been hit by moving vehicles, survived explosions at close range, been crushed by heavy objects. He has absorbed the kind of cumulative physical damage that should have killed him several dozen times over, and he walks away from each incident with his life, his consciousness, and, within a few scenes, his full mobility. His healing rate is not remarkable, it is supernatural. Marge Simpson shares the same protruding eyes. Her hair grows straight upward in a tower of pale blue that she has maintained in the same shape for 36 years without any visible structural support. She was briefly employed at the nuclear power plant herself, exposed to the same facility and the same violations. Her 3 children were conceived and born after both parents had already spent years living in Springfield's contaminated environment, breathing its air, drinking its water, living under the radiation signature of that cracked reactor. Bart has the spiky hair that maintains its geometry without any product or styling. Lisa has the same protruding eyes, the same impossible proportions. Maggie, the baby, has been 1 year old for longer than most of the show's current audience has been alive, and every single one of them has yellow skin. Now, here is the detail that anchors the entire theory. When characters from outside Springfield appear in the show, they look different. Guest appearances, celebrities, visitors from other cities, characters who are established to live elsewhere, they are drawn differently. Their proportions are closer to natural human anatomy. Their features have a quality that the regular Springfield residents do not. Their eyes sit normally in their faces. Their skin tones reflect actual human pigmentation. The show draws outsiders with more realistic proportions than it draws the people who live in Springfield. The standard explanation for this is that it is simply the art style. Springfield residents look a certain way because that is how the show draws its main characters. But that explanation stops working the moment you apply it to what the show's own visual language is actually telling you. Within the logic of the world the show has built, there is a visible and observable difference between people who come from Springfield and people who do not. The people inside the contamination zone look like they have been altered at the cellular level. The people from outside it look like they have not. Even the animals carry the mark. The Simpson family dog, Santa's little helper, has the same bulging eyes as his owners. The same proportional deviations from normal canine anatomy. The fish in the river near the plant have extra eyes. Springfield's wildlife is demonstrably affected by the runoff from the facility, and the show is explicit about this. It shows you a 3-eyed fish and tells you directly that this is what the radiation is doing to living organisms. It then asks you to believe that the same radiation has had zero measurable effect on the humans sharing that environment. And Burns, throughout all of it, has known. He has always known. The show establishes this across multiple episodes. Burns funds private medical research. He employs personal physicians. He undergoes weekly treatments that manage the effects of what amounts to chronic radiation exposure in his own body. Burns understands the biological consequences of nuclear contamination better than anyone in Springfield because he is personally dependent on managing those consequences to stay alive. He has the resources to synthesize experimental treatments. He has the medical infrastructure to monitor and adjust his own biological response to radiation in real time. He knows, with precision, what radioactive exposure does to living systems, because it is the only reason he is still breathing. And Homer's continued employment as safety inspector is not, under this theory, a matter of negligence. When German investors briefly purchased the plant during one story arc, the first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the actual cost of bringing the facility into compliance with safety standards, and the estimate nearly bankrupted them. Burns bought the plant back immediately and rehired Homer without hesitation. A competent safety inspector would shut that facility down within a week. Homer ensures that the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking, the water stays poisoned, and Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, and, by extension, over the economic life of the entire town. A population that is too cognitively impaired by decades of low-level radiation exposure to understand what is being done to them. The crayon in Homer's brain is presented by the show as a bizarre, isolated incident, a strange piece of backstory that explains his limited intelligence through a childhood accident. But the episode that reveals the crayon also does something quietly devastating. When Homer has the crayon removed, his intelligence returns. His IQ rises dramatically. He becomes articulate, perceptive, capable of following complex chains of reasoning. He can suddenly see Springfield for what it actually is. He can understand his job for what it actually is. He can assess his own life with a clarity that had been impossible for him before. And it makes him miserable, because an intelligent Homer living in Springfield is a Homer who can see the contamination, who can recognize the pattern, who can trace the cause of his own damage back to its source. And so he has the crayon put back in. He chooses the fog. He chooses the comfortable numbness of diminished intelligence over the unbearable clarity of understanding what has been done to him. But the question the show never pauses to ask is a more troubling one. How does a crayon end up lodged in a child's brain in the first place? How does Homer pass through his entire childhood, his adolescence, and his adult life visiting Springfield's medical establishment, receiving examinations and checkups from Springfield's doctors, without a single medical professional ever detecting a foreign object inside his skull? Either the medical establishment in Springfield is comprehensively compromised, or someone with the resources and the motive to keep Homer exactly as he is made sure that the crayon stayed where it was. Either way, the result is the same. Homer Simpson is exactly the kind of employee that Charles Montgomery Burns requires. Damaged enough to be compliant, impaired enough to be harmless, grateful enough to stay, incapable of connecting the dots between his own condition and the facility he has spent his entire adult life maintaining. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town full of eccentric characters and improbable situations. Springfield is a contamination zone. The yellow skin is not an art choice. The four fingers are not a stylistic shortcut. The superhuman resilience and the impaired cognition, and the mutated fish and the glowing billionaire in the woods are all symptoms of the same underlying cause. The cracked cooling towers, the leaking waste, the 342 violations that Burns could afford to fix and chose not to. Every strange thing about Springfield traces back to the same source. And the source is still running. It is still generating power. It is still leaking. And Homer Simpson is still at his workstation, asleep over his console, dreaming whatever dreams a man with a 55 IQ and a crayon in his brain is capable of. While the plant keeps humming in the background, quiet and patient, doing what it has always done. If you are watching this late at night or early in the morning, drop your location and time in the comments. It is always nice to know where in the world someone is letting Springfield lull them to sleep. And if you want more of this, subscribe. There is a lot more to get through tonight. There is something worth sitting with about the number 342 beyond its sheer scale. Each violation in that list represents a specific decision, or more precisely, a specific non-decision. A moment where someone in the plant's operational chain identified something wrong and either could not, or chose not to, address it. Multiplied 342 times across a single facility, what you have is not oversight. What you have is a culture. A culture in which non-compliance has become the operational baseline, in which the gap between what the regulations require and what the facility actually does has grown so wide and existed for so long that the regulations themselves have become notional, a distant theoretical framework, with no real bearing on what happens on the floor of the plant every day. Homer did not create this culture, but he is its ideal product. A safety inspector who cannot identify violations is not just a failed inspector, he is a structural feature of the system Burns requires. The violations do not continue because Homer fails to find them. They continue because Homer is the reason they do not need to be hidden. They can exist in plain sight, on surfaces Homer touches every day, attached to machinery Homer is nominally responsible for, in a building Homer enters 5 days a week, and Homer will not see them because Homer's cognitive architecture does not support the pattern recognition and causal reasoning that seeing them would require. Burns has never had to instruct Homer to ignore anything. Burns has never had to threaten Homer into silence. He has simply hired a man whose brain cannot do the work of seeing what is there, and then pointed at that man and called him the safety inspector, and relied on the implicit guarantee that the title provides without the function the title implies. The residents of Springfield, drinking the water that the plant contaminates, breathing the air that the plant affects, living the lives that the plant's presence has reshaped in ways both visible and invisible, are protected by this man. This is the sentence Burns has been living inside for the entirety of Homer's employment. The people of Springfield are protected by Homer Simpson, and Homer Simpson is the reason they have no protection at all. Springfield will never investigate itself. The contamination has already made sure of that. The capacity for the kind of sustained, uncomfortable, consequence-facing investigation that would be required to look directly at what the plant has done to the people who live near it is itself one of the things the contamination affects most reliably. The community cannot look directly at the source of its damage because the damage has already affected the part of the community's collective cognitive function that would need to be intact to initiate that look. This is the self-sealing quality of the contamination theory. The poison prevents the recognition of the poison. The damage prevents the investigation of the damage. The community continues because the contamination has ensured the community cannot clearly see what continuing costs. Burns does not have to actively suppress awareness of the situation. He has not had to for decades. The situation suppresses awareness of itself. All Burns has to do is keep the plant running, keep Homer at the console, and keep cashing the checks that the power monopoly generates. Everything else takes care of itself. The Blinky story deserves more examination than it typically receives because it was the moment when Springfield had the clearest possible opportunity to ask the obvious question and chose, collectively, not to ask it. A three-eyed fish pulled from a river adjacent to a nuclear plant is not ambiguous evidence. A child reaching the obvious conclusion would be doing so correctly. Springfield had this evidence. The town saw this fish on the news. A political campaign used it to argue for exactly the obvious conclusion and was treated as a legitimate political actor making a legitimate political argument. And then Burns ate the fish on television and the town moved on. Burns did not disprove the contamination. He ate a mutated fish. He did not address the question of why the fish was mutated or what the mutation indicated about the water supply. He did not commission an independent study. He performed a gesture of dismissal, and the community, whose capacity for sustained attention to uncomfortable truths exactly as compromised as the contamination theory predicts, accepted the reason and stopped attending. Blinky is still in the river, or Blinky's descendants are. The river still runs near the plant. The plant still runs. And the question that Blinky's existence raised has never been answered, not because the answer is unavailable, but because the community lost interest in asking. That is the contamination theory's most specific claim about Springfield. Not that the residents cannot think, that they cannot sustain the kind of thinking that produces consequences. That the chain between evidence and action is reliably broken at the maintenance point. Burns knows this. He has always known this. It is the foundation of his confidence that his violations will remain his violations, and that the town downstream from his plant will continue to drink from the river that Blinky swam in. The question of why nobody in Springfield ever coordinates their alarm into sustained action is one that the contamination theory answers with a precision that alternative explanations cannot match. Individuals in Springfield notice things. They react. They have moments of clarity about the situation around them. Homer has moments, even in his fog, of genuine perception of what is wrong. Lisa has sustained and articulate analysis of the community's problems. Even the background characters, the townspeople who appear in mob scenes and community meetings, display the capacity to identify injustice and respond to it with something that initially resembles organized action. But nothing sustains. Every reaction decays. Every moment of clarity gives way to the comfortable fog. Every community initiative encounters resistance from within itself and dissolves before it produces consequence. The town forms mobs and then disperses. It identifies problems and then forgets. It reaches the brink of accountability and then retreats to familiar comfort. This is not laziness. It is not stupidity in the ordinary sense. It is the specific failure mode of cognitive impairment at the community scale. The capacity to initiate exists. The capacity to sustain does not. And sustaining, maintaining the focus and the motivation and the coordination over the time required to produce structural change is exactly what the contamination theory predicts would be compromised by chronic low-level radiation exposure to the neurological systems that support executive function and long-term planning. Springfield cannot hold Burns accountable because holding Burns accountable is a long-term project. It requires sustained attention to evidence across time, coordinated action among individuals who maintain their coordination past the initial moment of impulse, and the willingness to accept short-term disruption in exchange for long-term improvement. All of these capacities are compromised in a community whose cognitive infrastructure has been eroded by decades of exposure to the contamination that the plant produces. Burns does not need to suppress the town. He does not need to actively prevent accountability. He simply needs to wait. The fog will do the rest. It always has. The town will reach the edge of action and then the fog will come in, gently, the way it always does, and by next week everything will have reset, and Homer will be at the console, and the violations will still be there, and Blinky will still be in the river, and Burns will sign the checks and conduct the treatments and keep the lights on and wait for the next moment when the town comes to the edge of doing something and then does not do it. He has been doing this for over a century. He is very good at it. Section 2, Homer's coma theory. Let the nuclear theory settle into the background now. Let it become part of the ambient noise of Springfield, that low hum beneath everything else. Because what we are about to discuss reframes the entire show in a single sentence, and once you hear it, you will not be able to watch an episode of The Simpsons again without at least a small part of your mind returning to it. What if Springfield is not a real place at all? What if the nuclear contamination, the mutated residents, the impossible recoveries, the characters who never age, the plots that grow progressively stranger with each passing season, what if all of it is happening inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since April of 1993? This is the Homer coma theory. It is the single most discussed, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. And the evidence for it begins on the night of April 1st, 1993, when the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. The episode was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple. Bart plays a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer. The final prank involves taking one of Homer's cans of beer to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the explosion is violent enough to hospitalize him. He is taken to Springfield General in serious condition. He is placed in a hospital bed. He is attended to by medical staff. And while he is lying there, still recovering from the explosion, he sees a vending machine on the other side of the room. He wants a candy bar. He gets up to retrieve it. The machine tips over, falls on him, and Homer Simpson flatlines. He enters a coma. A real clinical coma. Not a dream sequence, not a cutaway gag, not a brief joke that resolves in the same scene. Homer is in a documented unconscious state that the episode establishes lasts for 7 weeks. And then the episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart is at his bedside, tearful, confessing that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. The credits roll. Everything is fine, except for one detail that the show drops in the final moments of that episode and then essentially never addresses again. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% gone, destroyed, permanently. The medical staff tells him this. Homer hears the news that he has sustained irreversible neurological damage, that a portion of his brain has been lost forever, and his response is to laugh. He tells the family that he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The show continues. 32 more years of episodes follow, none of which mention that Homer is legally brain damaged from a documented coma in Season 4. Unless Homer never woke up, the coma theory proposes exactly this. Homer did not regain consciousness in April of 1993. The scene at the hospital bedside, the tearful Bart, the strangling, the laughter, all of it is part of the coma. The first moment of the dream. The beginning of an unconscious state that has never ended. Every episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character arc, every celebrity appearance, every impossible event and surreal plot and increasingly cartoonish situation. All of it is being generated by the damaged, dreaming mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing neurological function while his family sits beside him and waits. Let me walk through why this holds together so well. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a different kind of show. Not necessarily more realistic, it was always a cartoon, it was always operating in a heightened register. But the stories it told were grounded in recognizable human problems. Homer tries to stop drinking. Marge worries about her marriage. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher that mirrors the way children form attachments to authority figures when they feel unseen at home. Bart struggles with his grades and faces the possibility of being held back. The emotional core of early Simpsons was built from the texture of real domestic life. Financial stress, marital tension, the particular loneliness of being the smartest person in your family and having nobody notice. These are not universal problems in a vague sense. They are specific, grounded in recognizable human experience, told through satire but rooted in something true. After the coma episode, the show becomes something else entirely. Homer goes to space. He joins a secret society. He becomes the leader of a vigilante group. He discovers his mother, who has been alive all along, living as a fugitive radical. He encounters God on multiple occasions and has full conversations with him. He holds hundreds of different jobs across the series, from astronaut to boxing promoter to food critic to grease entrepreneur to military officer. He meets presidents and celebrities and figures from every corner of popular culture. He travels to dozens of countries, He survives physical trauma that would kill a trained soldier repeatedly without lasting consequence. The escalation from grounded domestic drama to increasingly surreal adventure is not gradual, it is seismic. And it happens precisely at the moment that the coma theory identifies as the boundary event. The show's own fans have been arguing for 20 years about when The Simpsons stopped being good. The coma theory has a very precise answer to that question. The Simpsons did not stop being good. Homer's brain started deteriorating. The dreams got stranger because the dreaming mind generating them was getting worse. The plots became more surreal because a brain losing function cannot maintain the same quality of simulation it could produce when it was healthier. The early seasons feel grounded because Homer's brain, in those first years of the coma, still had enough function to generate something that resembled his actual life. The later seasons feel unmoored because there is less and less cognitive architecture holding the dream together. Now, here is the detail that makes the theory something more than clever speculation. 6 months before the coma episode aired, in the season 4 premiere, Homer has a direct conversation with God. Not a dream sequence presented as such, not a fever vision, a face-to-face conversation with the divine in Homer's living room on a Sunday morning when he has decided to skip church. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something. God says that Homer will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. His time is coming, God says. Soon, but not yet. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline is exact. God told Homer his conscious life was approaching its end. He told him that the understanding he sought was on its way, just not quite yet. And 6 months after that conversation, Homer's conscious life ended in a hospital room in Springfield General, under a vending machine, with 5% of his brain function draining away into the silence of an extended unconscious state. The show presents the Homer the heretic scene as a comic theological gag, one of the show's most beloved early moments. But under the coma theory, it is not a gag, it is a prophecy. God was telling Homer that his waking life was nearly over. Everything that came after was the dream of a dying man holding on to the only thing that mattered to him, his family. Think about the aging problem. Think about the single most frequently cited mystery about The Simpsons, the fact that nobody ages, that Bart has been 10 years old for over 3 decades, that Lisa has been 8, that Maggie has been sucking on that pacifier since December of 1989. Every explanation offered for this produces some version of the same answer. The radiation theory says it is cellular mutation. The cartoon logic explanation says it is just how animated shows work. The production reality answer says that aging characters create continuity problems that a show running for decades cannot sustainably manage. All of these explanations are functional. None of them are emotionally satisfying. The coma theory has the simplest and most devastating answer of all. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993 and never woke up. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine his children growing up because it did not get to see it happen. It is working from a snapshot, a frozen image of his family taken on the last day he was conscious and projected forward indefinitely. Marge does not age because the last time Homer saw her, she looked exactly like that, and his brain has no material beyond that final image to work with. His kids stay young because in Homer's memory of them, they are forever young. The dream cannot age them because the dreamer has no experience of them aging to draw from. This is not a limitation of Homer's imagination. It is a feature of how coma states work on the human mind. They freeze the world at the last moment of conscious experience and hold it there, unchanged, like a photograph that can move but cannot progress. And the celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons of the show. Under the coma theory, these are not the result of Springfield becoming a destination for famous people. They are the result of Homer's brain, lying in that hospital room, receiving ambient stimulation from the environment around him. Television sounds filtering through the fog, conversations at his bedside, radio playing in the hallway. His damaged brain picks up names and voices and faces from the external world, processes them as fragments of incoming data, and incorporates them into the dream. Every celebrity who shows up in Springfield is a voice Homer heard through his coma, translated into a character by a mind that is desperately trying to keep its simulation populated and running. The show itself has engaged with this theory more directly than most fan theories ever get acknowledged. In season 34, the writers created a sequence in which Homer wakes up from a long coma with the clear implication that everything since the season 4 episode has been a dream. The sequence was initially presented as a leaked, deleted scene, creating genuine uncertainty about whether it was real. When it was ultimately confirmed as deliberate misdirection, a planted fake scene, the writers insisted it was not real, that Homer was not in a coma. But think about that choice for a moment. The writers of The Simpsons sat down and produced, fully animated, a scene in which Homer wakes from a coma and all of it is revealed to be a dream. They made that scene. They voiced it, animated it, finished it, and their method of addressing the theory was not to ignore it but to create content that depicted the theory being true and then say it was a joke. That is a strange way to dismiss something you do not take seriously. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in interviews, stating plainly that it is not true. Homer is not in a coma. The show has not been a dream since season 4. He said it clearly and without much elaboration. But he did not explain why nobody ages. He did not account for the precise tonal shift that begins at the exact episode the theory identifies. He offered no explanation for why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma, or why the show has grown progressively more surreal and detached from reality with each passing decade, in exactly the pattern you would expect from a dream being generated by a mind in slow decline. He said it is not true, and the conversation moved on. The theory persists because the alternative explanations leave too many questions unanswered, and because the coma theory answers all of them. The reset button that erases consequences between episodes. Homer's physical indestructibility. The increasingly impossible plots. The frozen ages. The celebrities. The way Springfield can be destroyed and rebuilt with no lasting damage by the next week's episode. All of it makes perfect sense if the show is happening inside the mind of a man who is not dead but is not quite alive either, generating an endless simulation of the life he loves because his brain refuses to let that life end. And here's the part that stays with you after everything else has faded. If the coma theory is true, the emotional core of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is one of the saddest things in the history of television. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his unconscious mind returns to again and again across every episode, is not adventure or fame or wealth. It is simpler than any of that. He wants Marge to still be there. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, exasperating, loving boy. He wants Lisa to still be playing her saxophone in her room. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in the crook of one arm. He wants Friday nights at the house on Evergreen Terrace, and Saturday mornings, and Sunday afternoons, and the particular quality of light in the kitchen in the morning when the family is all there at once. That is everything Homer Simpson wants. His family, preserved exactly as it was on the last day he was conscious. And in the coma, the dream gives it to him. His children never grow up. His wife never leaves. The house is always the same house. The beer is always cold in the fridge. Homer's coma is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. It is a kind of grace. The only heaven a man like Homer would ever think to ask for. Not clouds and angels and the resolution of all suffering. Just a house on Evergreen Terrace where nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every episode you have ever watched. Every couch gag, every donut, every strangling, every dough. Every moment where Homer gets something wrong and the family survives it anyway. Every time the credits roll and Springfield resets and the family comes back together, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the simulation finally fails, if the dream stops running, Homer has to face what is on the other side. And on the other side is the question of how much time has actually passed. Whether his children have grown up without him? Whether Marge is still there? Whether anyone is sitting beside his bed in that hospital room, or whether the chair has been empty for a long time now. The coma theory does not ruin The Simpsons. It makes every single episode an act of love. A man unconscious in a hospital bed, dreaming about his family, because they are the only thing worth dreaming about. And the show will never confirm it. But it will never fully disprove it either, because the evidence is not in any single episode. It is in the structure of the show itself. In the frozen ages and the tonal shift and the God who warned Homer that his time was coming, in the way the plots grow stranger year by year, like a signal slowly losing its source, in the way Homer always finds his way home by the end of every episode. Because in his dream, he never left. The question of what happens in Homer's dream as his brain deteriorates is one of the more unsettling threads in the coma theory, because it maps so precisely onto what long-term viewers actually experience watching the show across its full run. In the early post-coma seasons, the dream is vivid and coherent. The plots are contained. Characters behave with the internal consistency of people whose defining traits are well established. The world of the dream has physical and social logic. Things happen because other things cause them to happen. The Springfield of seasons 5 through 8 has the quality of a well-maintained dream, one that a brain generating it from memory and imagination has the resources to sustain with considerable fidelity to the emotional logic that makes it feel real. As the seasons advance, something shifts. The plots become more elaborate and less grounded. Characters do things that sit at an angle to their established personalities. Events occur that should have permanent consequences but are erased before the next episode begins. Celebrity figures appear with increasing frequency. Homer travels to more locations, undertakes more implausible adventures, holds more jobs that each in isolation represent a significant life change but that accumulate without apparent effect on the underlying reality. Under the coma theory, this is not creative drift. It is neurological drift. The brain generating the simulation is losing the structural integrity that made the early dream so coherent. As that integrity erodes, the dream becomes increasingly associative rather than causal. Events are triggered by proximity and emotional resonance rather than by narrative logic. The seasons that fans call the bad ones are not bad. They are the dream of a man whose brain is fighting to stay alive with fewer and fewer resources. Every additional season is not a creative decision, it is a survival signal. Homer's unconscious mind refusing to release the simulation, insisting on the continuation of the story even as the story becomes harder to hold together, because the continuation of the story is the continuation of the dream, and the continuation of the dream is the only form of continuation left available to him. There is one other element of the coma theory that rarely gets the attention it deserves. If Homer has been dreaming since April of 1993, then what we have been watching for over 3 decades is not a comedy. It is a portrait of loyalty. Everything in the dream, every plot, every resolution, every moment where Homer does something idiotic and the family absorbs it and continues, every episode that ends with the family intact and the relationship still fundamentally sound, all of it is Homer's mind insisting on the truth he cannot give up. His family loves him, even when he makes it hard. Even when his limitations cost them in ways that ought to produce consequences. They absorb him. They continue with him. They choose him episode after episode because in Homer's dream, in the Springfield that his unconscious mind has built and maintains against all the pressure of deterioration, his family always chooses him. That is not a comedy premise. That is the deepest and most private hope of a man lying in a hospital bed, alone inside his own mind, holding on to the only truth that matters to him. That somewhere, in the real world he can no longer reach, the people he loves are still there, still waiting, still choosing him. He will not let the dream end, because if the dream ends, he has to find out whether that truth is real. The God conversation is the element of the coma theory that receives the least attention and that arguably provides the most direct textual support for the theory within the show itself. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere called Homer the Heretic, Homer has a direct face-to-face conversation with God. This is not a dream. This is not a Treehouse of Horror non-canonical episode. This is a regular episode of The Simpsons, in which the theological architecture of the show's universe is briefly and directly engaged. Homer quits going to church. God appears to him. They talk. During the conversation, God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life. But not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. The language is specific. The time is coming. Not that Homer will get around to learning something eventually, that a specific time is approaching, a reckoning of some kind. A threshold. 6 months later, in April of 1993, the vending machine falls and Homer flatlines and the threshold arrives. The coma theory reads God's words as a prophecy that the show itself partially encoded. Whatever the show's creators intended by the exchange in Homer the Heretic, whatever the writers meant when they had God tell Homer his time was coming, the timeline is undeniable. God said Homer's time was coming. 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ended, and everything that has aired since that moment is, under the coma theory, either a record of that ending or a dream generated by the man who has not come back from it. The theological implications of this, within the show's own internal logic, are worth sitting with quietly. The God who speaks to Homer in Homer the Heretic is the same God who, in later episodes, is depicted as genuinely existing within the show's universe and as occasionally intervening in Springfield's affairs. If that God told Homer his time was coming, and if that time arrived exactly as implied, then the coma itself is not accidental. It is not the random consequence of a vending machine falling on a man who reached for it at the wrong moment. It is what God told Homer was coming: a threshold, a transition from one mode of existence to another. Not an ending, exactly, but a change in the kind of reality Homer would be inhabiting. The show never returns to this reading. The writers have not endorsed it. God's words to Homer are treated as a theological gag, a piece of comedy business in an episode about Homer's complicated relationship with organized religion. But the words are there, in the transcript, in the canonical record of the show. God told Homer his time was coming, and then Homer's time came. Whether you read that as prophecy, coincidence, or the show's writers making choices they did not fully intend, it remains one of the most uncomfortable pieces of internal evidence the coma theory has at its disposal. And it sits in the archive, patient and undeniable, 6 months before the vending machine, in a conversation that the show has never quite acknowledged the weight of. Section 3: Who really shot Mr. Burns? Before we move forward, take a slow breath. Let your body settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting tonight, because what we are going into now is the greatest unsolved mystery in the history of The Simpsons, and possibly in the history of animated television. You know the answer. Everyone knows the answer. Maggie did it. Season 7, Episode 1, Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2. Case closed, the baby did it, everyone go home. Except the case was never really closed. Not in any satisfying sense. The more carefully you examine the evidence the show presents, the more the official verdict starts to look like something constructed after the fact, rather than something that grew organically from the facts on the ground. And the more you look at the alternatives, the more some of them start to look considerably more credible than a 1-year-old infant with a gun. Let me take you back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25. The summer of 1995. The Simpsons did something that no animated show had ever attempted before. They constructed a genuine mystery, a serialized whodunit with real suspects, real evidence, real red herrings, and a cliffhanger ending designed to hold the entire country in suspense for 3 months. The show's promotional machinery treated it as a cultural event. Fox promoted the mystery aggressively. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, treating the fictional crime as an actual unsolved case and presenting it with the same serious procedural tone they used for real fugitives and real victims. The show created a national contest inviting viewers to submit their best guesses about who shot Mr. Burns. The prize was inclusion in a future episode, to be animated as a background character in the show's world. It was a genuine cultural moment. Bars put up chalkboards, offices ran pools, the internet, which was still young and considerably smaller in 1995, buzzed with theories. America was invested in the answer to a question about a cartoon billionaire getting shot. But to understand why the answer matters, and why the official answer is so contested, you need to understand what happened in Part 1. Mr. Burns, by the end of that episode, had managed to wrong essentially every significant character in Springfield. He had stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary School, gutting the school's budget and eliminating programs that the students depended on. He had financially ruined Moe's Tavern, forcing its closure and devastating Moe personally. He had created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle, leaving elderly residents, including Grandpa Simpson, without a home. He had caused injuries to Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. And for the capstone of this particular arc of villainy, he had built a massive mechanical disc and deployed it to block out the sun over the entire town of Springfield. Not as a temporary stunt, as a permanent business strategy, Burns literally stole the sun from Springfield so that every resident would be forced to buy their electricity from his plant because natural light was no longer available to them. When Smithers, his loyal assistant of decades, objected to this plan, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of Part 1, the show had systematically constructed a motive for nearly every character in its ensemble. Homer, who had endured years of his employer being unable to remember his own name, Bart and Lisa, whose school had been defunded, Grandpa, whose retirement home had been destroyed, groundskeeper Willie, who lost his job when the school lost its money, Tito Puente, the jazz musician whose program at the school was eliminated, Moe, whose bar was gone. Smithers, freshly fired, and, the show establishes, spiraling into alcoholism as a direct result. The whole town gathered in a public meeting to confront Burns. The tension was genuine, even by the show's usually comic standards. Multiple characters were shown holding weapons. The anger was collective and real. And then Burns was shot. A single bullet, he staggered, fell onto the town sundial with his hands landing on two letters, the shape of his fall tracing the initials W and S, or from Burns's perspective, M and S. The ambulance took him away. The screen went dark. America waited. Part 2 aired in September of that same year. Chief Wiggum conducted an investigation. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession collapsed when the investigation established that Smithers had been blackout drunk on the night in question and had actually discharged a firearm in a completely different location, shooting Jasper in his wooden leg. Wrong victim, wrong crime, wrong night essentially. One by one, suspects were cleared. Principal Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente had what the show presents as the greatest alibi in television history, a complete musical number in which he explains that he channeled all of his rage into creating art, specifically a samba, and thus had no remaining emotional energy with which to commit violence. The investigation reached an impasse until police recovered a key piece of physical evidence. An eyelash found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis of the eyelash pointed to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints were on the gun. He had the most clearly established and most personal motive of anyone in town. Years of being ignored and forgotten by his own employer having pushed him to a documented breaking point. Homer was arrested. He was about to face trial. And then Burns woke up from his coma and identified his shooter. Maggie. Baby Maggie Simpson. According to Burns's account, he encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He attempted to take her lollipop. A struggle ensued. His gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked up the gun. The gun fired. Burns was shot. Case closed. Baby did it. Chief Wiggum noted that no jury in the world would convict a baby, and the whole matter was dropped. Except, the first problem with the official answer is the contest. The show told the public that the mystery was solvable from the clues planted in Part 1. It promoted a national contest based on this premise. People across America spent a summer thinking about the clues and developing theories. And when the answer was finally revealed, according to the DVD commentary, essentially nobody in the randomly selected contest sample had guessed correctly. Not a significant number of close guesses. Not a few people who nearly had it. Nobody. The one person documented to have submitted the correct answer did so on an early internet news group on the night of the original broadcast and was using a college email account that had become inactive by the time the show's producers tried to track them down. The producers even issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. There is no record of them ever having done so. Think about what this tells you. Either the clues were genuinely insufficient for a viewer to arrive at the correct answer from Part 1 alone, or the answer was determined after the fact, and the clues were then shaped to point toward it, rather than having the answer predetermined, and the clues constructed to lead there honestly. The show's own creators cycled through multiple possible shooters during development, including Barney Gumble, who was at one point the leading candidate and for whom a full arc was planned involving imprisonment. They settled on Maggie because, as the DVD commentary and various interviews establish, a baby shooter had a certain absurdist charm and, crucially, created no narrative consequences because, as the show itself says, no jury in the world would convict a baby. The mystery was reverse engineered. The clues were adjusted to fit the answer rather than the answer emerging from the clues. Now look at the physical evidence more carefully. Burns's gun was missing from its holster before the shooting. The show establishes this. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon, which means the shooter was someone who did not come to the town meeting armed. Most of the established suspects arrived carrying weapons because they were angry enough to consider violence. The shooter is therefore someone who was not planning to shoot Burns, who did not bring a weapon for that purpose, who encountered the gun by chance and used it in a moment that was not premeditated. A baby finding a gun on the ground is consistent with this profile. So are a significant number of other characters. Burns's last words before he was shot, the show establishes this through the investigation, were a recognizable utterance. Something to the effect of, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker. He greeted them with the familiarity of someone encountering a known acquaintance. Not shock, not fear, just a low-effect acknowledgement of a familiar face. Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? The show does not establish a prior relationship between Burns and Maggie before this episode. Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer works for him directly, has worked for him for years, has had dozens of direct interactions with him. The idea that Burns would encounter a baby in a parking lot and respond with the calm, low-key acknowledgement, "Oh, it's you," as though greeting someone he knows, does not fit what we understand about how Burns experiences the world. Then there is the season 18 moment that the show presents and then immediately abandons. Homer, in a casual context, states that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it out loud, on camera, in front of witnesses, and nobody responds. Nobody investigates. Nobody opens any kind of inquiry. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line and moves on. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is within the range of his character, or the original verdict was wrong and Homer is saying something true that nobody has any institutional interest in pursuing because the case is closed, and reopening it would require someone in Springfield to do something uncomfortable. The most compelling alternate theory identifies Marge as the actual shooter. The case for Marge is stronger than it might initially appear. Burns had systematically destroyed things that Marge loved: her children's school, her family's dog, the community her children live in. She had clear motive. She is, when genuinely provoked, a person of considerable resolve. She was at the town meeting. She did not, crucially, arrive at that meeting carrying a weapon, which fits the profile of someone who encountered Burns's gun by accident rather than someone who came prepared to use one. And Burns, the show has established in a prior episode, developed a significant romantic interest in Marge. The feelings were entirely one-sided, but they were real within the show's continuity. Burns fell for Marge in an earlier story arc. He was infatuated with her. And under this theory, when Burns fell onto the sundial and was losing consciousness from a gunshot wound, and the question was whether to name his attacker, he chose not to. He protected Marge. He let the investigation chase other leads, let it land on Maggie as a technically accurate partial truth, or as a deliberate misdirection, because naming Marge would mean Marge faced consequences, and Burns, in whatever strange way was available to a man of his nature, did not want Marge to face consequences. The sundial, the central piece of supposed evidence, the image of Burns's hands falling on those specific letters and spelling out Maggie Simpson as the answer, is undercut by the show itself. Burns states on record that his landing on those letters was not intentional. He did not deliberately position himself to communicate his attacker's identity. He fell. The letters are coincidence. The central piece of physical evidence that the show uses to justify its answer is described by the victim himself as meaningless. And the alternate endings. The writers produced a full, complete, fully voiced and animated ending in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. Not a rough cut, not a sketch, a finished alternate conclusion to the mystery. This ending was shown publicly, described as the ending that was almost used, and then dismissed on the grounds that accepting it would require ignoring the DNA evidence, at which point the show makes a very specific joke. The line in the clip show that reveals this alternate ending notes that ignoring DNA evidence would be downright nutty, a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which had concluded earlier that same year with a verdict that many people at the time believed had required doing exactly that. The show is winking at you. It is telling you that ignoring evidence to reach a verdict you prefer is something that happens. It is telling you that the official answer is not necessarily the correct one. It is telling you that the people with power over the investigation get to decide what the evidence means. The final shot of the episode shows Maggie alone in a room after everyone else has left. She checks her surroundings, making sure no one is watching, and then she moves her pacifier in a gesture that resembles pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as confirmation. Maggie did it, and she knows what she did, and she is in some baby-appropriate way aware of the significance of the act. But watch it again. A 1-year-old child sees someone fire a gun. The child watches the event happen. Later, alone, the child reenacts what she witnessed, because reenactment is one of the core behaviors through which very young children process events they have observed. Maggie is not confessing. Maggie is remembering. She is repeating the motion of something she saw an adult do, the way babies repeat sounds and gestures and expressions that they encounter in the world around them. She watched someone shoot Mr. Burns, and she is, alone in that room, playing back what she saw. Who shot Mr. Burns? The show says Maggie. The show has always said Maggie. The writers stand behind it, the DVD commentary treats it as settled, and the official record of the show's canon confirms it. But the contest nobody won. The clues that Burns himself described as coincidental. The alternate endings that were fully produced. The Season 18 confession. The fact that the show's own writers did not know who did it when they were writing Part 1. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was never solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, as you are about to see in a later section of tonight's journey through this town, those are two very different things. Let's do what the Springfield Police Department manifestly failed to do and actually reconstruct the crime scene with the information the show provides. Burns is carrying a gun at the meeting. The holster is later shown empty. The gun has been taken from him. When was the gun taken? Who was in proximity to Burns during the meeting and afterward? Getting a weapon off someone who is carrying it in a holster, in a room full of people, in a situation of high tension, without that person noticing, requires either that the person being disarmed is distracted, or that the person doing the taking has proximity that makes it possible, or that the disarming happens in a moment of brief physical contact that provides cover for it. Who in the meeting was close enough to Burns to take the gun without him noticing? Homer is one answer, and the fingerprints on the gun support this. Homer had the gun at some point. The question is whether he had it during the shooting or before, and whether taking it from Burns was a decision or an accident. The prints do not establish that Homer fired the shot. They establish that Homer's hands were on the gun at some point between when it left Burns's holster and when it was recovered. Burns wakes up and says, "Maggie." This is the end of the official investigation. But the official investigation was run by Chief Wiggum, whose competence is among the most comprehensively satirized elements of the show, and it concluded with the testimony of a man recovering from a gunshot wound who had been unconscious since the shooting. Nobody asked why Burns recognized Maggie in a parking lot at night well enough to say, "It's you," with the specific confidence of recognition. Nobody asked why he would attempt to take a baby's lollipop in a parking lot at night immediately after leaving a town meeting, where an entire community had just expressed its intention to hold him accountable. The shooting remains the greatest mystery in Simpsons history, not because the clues are insufficient, but because the investigation was never actually conducted. What Springfield got instead was a resolution. A name. A person on whom the case could be closed. A baby who will never go to trial. Whatever actually happened in that parking lot, the case is closed, and Springfield has moved on. The way it always moves on. The way it is designed to move on. The real story is wherever real stories go in a town that has made forgetting into policy. There is a dimension of the Burns shooting that rarely gets discussed because it requires engaging with the question of what Burns was doing in the parking lot in the first place, and why the official account of his confrontation with Maggie requires him to be doing something that does not particularly fit the character the show has spent years establishing. Burns carries a gun. He is powerful, wealthy, and has significant institutional influence over Springfield's law enforcement and political infrastructure. The gun exists as a character detail, an expression of his willingness to use direct force if necessary, and as a statement about his self-image as someone who operates beyond the normal constraints of social behavior. Burns is also, by any physical measure, extremely frail. He has essentially no physical strength. He cannot lift objects, cannot defend himself in any conventional sense, and has been overpowered on multiple occasions by individuals who would not typically be described as physically formidable. His power is institutional and financial, not physical. Given this profile, the official account requires us to believe that after a community meeting where the entire town had just expressed organized hostility toward him, Burns chose to confront a baby in a parking lot over a lollipop, not to leave, not to return to the safety of his secured facilities, to initiate a physical confrontation with an infant over a piece of candy. The psychology does not act. Burns does not pick fights with babies in parking lots. Burns does not pick fights with anyone directly when the alternative of institutional power is available. Burns is the person who, when Homer angers him, does not confront Homer himself but deploys institutional resources to make Homer's life difficult. Direct physical confrontation is not how Burns operates. The official account of the shooting requires Burns to have behaved in a way that is inconsistent with his established character in a public parking lot immediately after the most hostile community confrontation of his recent tenure, for reasons that amount to wanting a baby's candy. An alternate account, one in which Burns encountered someone in that parking lot who had legitimate reason to be there and legitimate reason to confront him, and who produced the gun from wherever it had ended up after the meeting, requires considerably less departure from established character to be coherent. Burns said it's you. The someone in the parking lot was someone he recognized. The recognition was not the careful recognition of a man uncertain about what he is seeing. It was the immediate, relaxed, slightly weary recognition of someone encountering a familiar presence in an expected context. That recognition is not how you greet a baby who has wandered into the parking lot. That is how you greet someone you know, whose presence in that location makes sense to you, and whose reason for being there you understand without needing to have it explained. The official account asks you to file this away as Burns greeting a baby he has had essentially no prior interaction with, as though encountering a familiar acquaintance. The alternative account asks you to accept that Burns has recognized someone he actually knew, someone who had followed him from the meeting for reasons that made complete sense, and that the testimony Burns provided about the baby was the most politically convenient available answer, rather than the most accurate one. Section 4. The Immortality of Mr. Burns. Let your breathing slow. There is no rush here. We are moving gently through Springfield tonight, section by section, and the next stop is the man at the center of everything. The man who has been at the center of everything for longer than any human being should be able to remain anywhere. Charles Montgomery Burns. Let us address the basic question first, the one the show raises repeatedly and never fully resolves. How old is he? The show's canon on this point is deliberately contradictory, but every version of the timeline, no matter how liberally you interpret it, places Burns's birth somewhere in the late 19th century. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has told first-hand stories about events from the 1910s. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's current audience was born. He attended Yale. He served in World War II. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it hidden for decades. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the most generous reading of the show's internally contradictory continuity, he might be pushing 140. And he does not merely exist at this age. He functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates local politics with the sophisticated understanding of someone who has been watching political systems operate for a century. He orchestrates multi-layered schemes that require sustained cognitive effort, long-term strategic planning, and a working familiarity with modern finance, modern law, and modern technology. His body is extraordinarily frail. His physical strength is almost non-existent. There is a running joke in the show that even a child's gentle breeze could knock him over. But his mind is razor-sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a ruthlessness and a precision that nobody in the town can match. And he has been operating at that level for longer than any human mind should be capable of sustained function. The show addresses the mechanism of his survival directly in the Springfield Files, the Season 8 episode we discussed during the nuclear contamination section. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so chemically and radiologically extreme, that it causes his body to emit visible light. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, by the following week, he is dead. His body requires this intervention on a precise, non-negotiable weekly schedule. Miss one dose and the margin for error collapses entirely. This is not medicine in any conventional sense. Burns is not taking a daily supplement or managing a chronic condition with medication. He is being kept alive through a recurring process that his biology has become entirely dependent on, a process that involves his body absorbing significant amounts of radiation and chemical compounds, which his system then metabolizes to sustain the cellular functions that normal human biology handles automatically. Burns does not survive through biology, he survives through maintenance. Think about what that means for a moment. Burns's continued existence is not a product of remarkable health or exceptional genetics. It is a product of infrastructure, of money and the specific medical resources that money can acquire, and the logistical competence of the one person who manages Burns's schedule and ensures he never misses a treatment. That person is Waylon Smithers. The show presents the relationship between Burns and Smithers in primarily comic and emotional terms. Smithers' devotion to Burns is one of the running threads of the series, played alternately for laughs and for something approaching genuine pathos. Smithers worships Burns. He has organized his entire life around Burns's needs, his preferences, his comfort, his survival. But under the lens of what we know about Burns's medical requirements, Smithers' devotion is not just emotional. It is, quite literally, the reason Burns is still alive. Smithers manages the treatment schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every weekly appointment. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with an attentiveness that goes far beyond what any job description would require. He is not a devoted assistant. He is the only person who fully understands Burns's survival protocol and is capable of executing it with the precision that Burns's situation demands. Without Smithers, Burns misses a treatment. Without the treatment, Burns's disease equilibrium collapses. And now we need to talk about the diseases. In one of the most famous scenes in the entire run of the series, Burns visits a doctor who informs him that he has every known disease simultaneously. Not most diseases. Not an unusual number of diseases. Every single disease known to medical science, all present in Burns's body at the same time. The doctor explains that these diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium within Burns's biology. Each one cancels out the others. They are all trying to kill him at once, and because they are all present simultaneously, none of them can gain enough dominance to succeed. The doctor compares it to three people trying to get through a doorway at the same time. They all block each other. Nobody gets through. The doctor's conclusion is that Burns is the sickest man in the United States, but is essentially indestructible because the complete saturation of every possible illness creates a biological standoff in which no single condition can progress to a fatal degree. This is played as comedy. It is one of the show's most beloved moments. But if you accept what we know about Burns's weekly treatments and apply it to this medical impossibility, a terrifying kind of logic emerges. Burns's diseases are not in equilibrium through any natural process. The weekly radiation treatments are the mechanism. They do not cure his diseases, they manage them. They maintain each illness at exactly the level of intensity necessary to prevent any single one from gaining an advantage over the others. It is calibrated biological management on a weekly cycle, and the calibration is what keeps Burns alive. His body is a reactor. The treatments are the control rods. Remove them, and the equilibrium fails, and every illness in his system surges forward at once. Burns understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield, not because of his industrial background, though that is certainly part of it, but because radiation is the mechanism keeping him alive. He has spent over a century learning to manage his own body's response to nuclear exposure, because that management is the only thing standing between him and the collapse of his internal disease equilibrium. And this is what makes his ongoing contamination of Springfield so particularly chilling. Burns knows exactly what radioactive exposure does to biological systems because he has spent more than 100 years watching it work on his own body. He knows the mechanisms of mutation and cellular damage and neurological impairment. He knows because he is personally experiencing, managing, and surviving all of it on a weekly basis with the help of resources that nobody else in Springfield has access to. He is not ignorant of the effects of the contamination his plant is producing. He is the single most informed person in Springfield about those effects. And he chooses, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, to continue allowing that contamination to leak into the environment of the community that depends on him for power. The question the show raises, but never fully engages with, is whether Burns's longevity is unique to him or whether the Burns dynasty, which the show establishes as one of the oldest and most consistently powerful family legacies in American history, has always had access to life extension methods of various kinds. The wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The family influence has been continuous across centuries, through generations of Burnsian patriarchs who maintained control of the family fortune long enough to pass it intact to the next in line. That kind of continuity across that kind of time span does not emerge from normal succession practices. It requires either extraordinary luck across multiple centuries or something more deliberate. Burns himself has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show. He has been shot by Maggie Simpson. He has been hospitalized repeatedly. He has collapsed, been attacked, been abandoned in the wilderness, been subjected to physical and chemical assaults that would have ended any normal person. And each time, he comes back. Not through the passive cartoon resilience that allows Homer to walk away from impossible injuries, but through the active deployment of medical infrastructure, through the machinery of wealth which ensures that whatever happens to his physical form, there will always be the resources necessary to reconstitute him and get him back to his next weekly treatment. Homer's survival is passive. Something bad happens to Homer, and his body simply absorbs it, which is consistent with the radiation theory's suggestion that his biology has been so thoroughly altered by decades of exposure that normal rules of physical damage no longer apply to him. Burns's survival is engineered. He has spent more than a century building a system designed specifically to ensure his continued existence, regardless of what external forces or internal biology might otherwise produce. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has ever corrupted, every politician he has ever purchased, every doctor he has ever retained, it all serves the same purpose. Keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the empire dies with him, and the empire is the only thing that can maintain the treatments, and without the treatments, there is no Burns. It is a closed system, self-sustaining and self-perpetuating, and Springfield is the environment that feeds it. The power plant employs the town depends on the plant depends on Burns depends on his treatments depend on the infrastructure that his wealth provides, and his wealth depends on the plant continuing to operate, with its violations intact, with Homer in the safety inspector's chair, with the water continuing to run through contaminated pipes into the homes of people who are too cognitively impaired to demand otherwise. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. And Burns cannot die because dying would mean the system he built would have to face a reckoning with what it has done to the people who live inside it. He is not immortal in any mystical sense. There is no dark magic or supernatural intervention. He is something considerably more mundane and considerably more frightening than that. He is a man who is simply too expensive to die. And Springfield has been paying the bill in water quality and air quality and cognitive function, and the physical integrity of everyone who has spent their lives in the shadow of his cracked cooling towers for longer than most of them have been alive. The medical architecture that keeps Burns alive has implications for what Burns represents within the show's thematic architecture that are worth examining directly. He is the only character in Springfield who is actively and successfully fighting the cognitive decline that the contamination theory suggests is affecting the entire community. Everyone else in Springfield is experiencing the gradual erosion of neurological function that comes with living in the contaminated environment, the slow diminishment of critical thinking capacity, the fog of impaired cognition that keeps the community from clearly seeing its own situation. Burns is experiencing the same contamination. He owns it. It comes from his facility, but he has the resources and the infrastructure to manage its effects in his own body in ways that no one else in Springfield can access. He is the only resident of the contaminated zone who is not being reduced by the contamination, because he is the only resident who can afford the countermeasures. The contamination affects everyone in Springfield except the person who controls it, not because he is immune, because he has the resources to treat himself. The poison that dims the reasoning capacity of every other resident of Springfield is something Burns manages in himself with weekly precision, while the same poison continues its work on the population that cannot afford to do what Burns does. The population is impaired. Burns is not, and the impaired population cannot see clearly enough to identify the source of the impairment, or to understand that the man at the top of the hierarchy is the one person in the system who has been protected from what the system does to everyone else. The doctors who treat Burns, the researchers who develop the treatment protocols, the pharmaceutical division that synthesizes the compounds, they are all funded by Burns and operating under his direction. The most advanced medical knowledge in Springfield about the effects of radiation on human biology is held exclusively by a private organization whose owner has every incentive to keep that knowledge proprietary. The community that most needs to understand what radiation exposure does to human biological systems is the community that is most completely denied access to that understanding, because the only person with the resources to develop that understanding is the person with the most to lose from its public availability. Burns does not just benefit from the contamination. He controls the knowledge of the contamination. He controls what is known about it, what is treated, and what remains invisible. That is the full architecture of what Burns has built, And Springfield, impaired and dependent and without access to the knowledge that would make clear what it is experiencing, lives inside it every day, sending its children to the school near the plant and watching the three-eyed fish story get filed away as a local color piece rather than as evidence of a public health catastrophe that has been building for decades. The question of Burns's historical memory adds another layer. He remembers the Gilded Age as personal experience. He describes the social and economic dynamics of the late 19th century with the casual familiarity of someone who lived inside them. He is not patient with Springfield's residents because patience is his temperament. He is unmoved by them because he has seen enough iterations of the same patterns to know exactly how each one will resolve. The angry employee, the political challenger, the federal inspector, he has watched all of these scenarios resolve in his favor so many times that the question of whether they will resolve in his favor no longer requires active thought. Burns is not a villain in the ordinary narrative sense. He is something more unusual, a man so old and so consistently powerful that resistance has long since been sorted into the category of environmental conditions rather than meaningful opposition. He does not fear accountability because he has not encountered accountability in a very long time. And in Springfield, in the town he has shaped and poisoned and economically captured over the course of a century, he is not likely to encounter it soon. There is one more dimension to the Burns immortality theory that deserves attention, which is the question of what Springfield would actually look like if Burns died, and whether the show has ever shown us anything that suggests it would survive his death. The show has depicted scenarios in which Burns temporarily loses control of the plant, through purchase by outside investors, through personal incapacitation, through brief periods of his power being suspended. In each of these scenarios, something significant happens. The plant nearly becomes unable to operate under any responsible management because the cost of compliance is so extreme. The town's economy, which is entirely built on the assumption that the plant will continue to employ its workforce and generate the economic activity that sustains the community, becomes immediately threatened. Springfield's economy is not diversified. It does not have multiple major employers competing for workforce attention and providing multiple sources of economic stability. It has the plant. The plant is the center of gravity around which every other economic activity in Springfield orbits. The shops exist because plant workers shop in them. The restaurants exist because plant workers eat in them. The school exists because plant workers pay the taxes that fund it. The houses have value because plant workers bought them. Remove the plant and the whole structure collapses immediately. Burns is the plant. The plant is Burns. They have been one thing for long enough that the distinction between the man and the facility is no longer practically meaningful. Burns's continued existence and the plant's continued operation are the same event, expressed in two different ways. This means that the people of Springfield, however damaged they are by what the plant has done to them, are also entirely dependent on it. The thing that has been hurting them is also the thing sustaining them. The contamination and the paycheck come from the same source. The three-eyed fish and the mortgage payment are both downstream from the same cracked cooling tower. You cannot oppose what you depend on for survival, not in any sustained way. Not in Springfield, where the cognitive impairment limits the capacity for sustained opposition anyway. Springfield cannot demand accountability from the plant, because demanding accountability from the plant would begin the process of shutting it down, and shutting it down would begin the process of ending the only economy the town has. Burns understood this before Springfield did, probably has understood it for most of the century he has been operating there. The monopoly is not just an economic arrangement, it is a hostage situation. The hostage is Springfield's ability to sustain itself, and Burns is the only person with the key. So the plant runs. The treatments continue. The violations stay. Homer sleeps at the console, and Burns, sustained by his weekly radiation intervention and his centuries of accumulated wealth and his monopoly over the only resource the town cannot live without, continues as he has always continued. Too expensive to die, too necessary to challenge. In Springfield, those are the same thing. Section 5. Maggie's Hidden Genius. Sink a little deeper now. Let the weight of everything you are resting on support you completely. We are staying in the Simpson house for this next section, but we are moving to the quietest corner of it. Maggie Simpson. She does not talk. She does not walk with any reliability. She communicates through pacifier sounds and the occasional gesture, and if you are paying close attention, a very precise and very deliberate arrangement of her enormous eyes that conveys considerably more information than most adults bother to look for. She has been 1-year-old for 36 years, and in that time, in that perpetual and impossible infancy, she has done more than any other member of her family. She shot a billionaire. She organized and led a rebellion among infants against a tyrannical daycare administrator. She has saved her family from immediate physical danger on multiple documented occasions. She has demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceed what most adult characters in Springfield can manage. She has been tested for cognitive ability, and the results, depending on which episode you look at, suggest intelligence so far beyond normal parameters that the standard tests used to measure it are simply inadequate. And through all of it, she has not said a word. Let us begin with the shooting, because it is the act that defines her in the public consciousness, even though it is arguably the least interesting thing she has ever done. We have already examined the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery in considerable detail. We have looked at the evidence and found it less conclusive than the show's official position would suggest. But whether or not Maggie actually pulled the trigger, the aftermath is what matters for understanding who she is. A baby was identified as the perpetrator of a shooting. The police investigated. The evidence was examined. The conclusion reached by the official institutions of Springfield was that an infant had committed an act of deliberate violence against a grown man, and that there was nothing to be done about it because the institutional structures designed to address such things have no mechanism for dealing with an infant perpetrator. Chief Wiggum's exact words are memorable. No jury in the world would convict a baby, and that, officially, was the end of it. But look at the final shot of that episode with fresh eyes. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around the space in a slow, deliberate sweep, checking each corner, each angle, making sure that she is not being observed. This is not a baby randomly turning her head. This is a child conducting a surveillance sweep of her environment with the methodical care of someone who has learned that certain things should not be witnessed. And then, once she has confirmed that the room is empty, she moves her pacifier in a slow motion that mimics the action of pulling a trigger. Step through what that sequence requires. It requires situational awareness. She knows that the room was full of people a moment ago and is now empty, and she distinguishes between these two states in a way that is operationally meaningful to her. It requires memory. She is recalling a specific event and reproducing a specific physical gesture associated with that event. It requires caution, the capacity to evaluate the risk of performing a particular action and to defer that performance until the risk is reduced to an acceptable level. And it requires impulse control, the ability to want to do something and to wait until the right moment to do it, rather than simply acting immediately. None of these are characteristics we associate with infants. None of these cognitive capacities are typically present in a 1-year-old child. They are characteristics associated with someone who understands their situation with considerable clarity and has developed a sophisticated behavioral strategy in response to that understanding. Maggie checked to make sure nobody was watching, and then she reenacted the shooting. Now look at The Longest Daycare. This is a theatrical short film released in 2012, nominated for an Academy Award, and it is 7 minutes of Maggie Simpson doing things that should not be possible for a child who cannot yet walk without falling over. The setup is simple. Maggie is at a daycare center run with rigid, authoritarian efficiency. She encounters a caterpillar in the process of becoming a butterfly and decides to protect it from another baby, a bully named Gerald, who wants to destroy it. What follows is a sequence in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, navigates the daycare's security systems, manages the attention and movements of the adult staff, and ultimately succeeds in protecting the caterpillar and releasing the butterfly to safety. She does all of this without speaking a word. More significantly, she does it through observation, planning, improvisation under pressure, and adaptive problem-solving. She reads her environment and identifies the relevant elements. She develops a strategy, recognizes when the strategy needs to change in response to new information, and adjusts. She executes a multi-step plan that requires timing, spatial reasoning, and the ability to predict how other people will behave in response to specific stimuli. She is, in other words, operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support. Her body keeps failing her. She falls, she crawls when she needs to run, she is limited by the physical constraints of a 1-year-old's motor skills, but her decision-making is essentially flawless. Every choice she makes is the correct one. Every adaptation to changing circumstances is optimal. She is limited by her body. She is not limited by her mind. Now consider the pattern this establishes across the full run of the show. Maggie is not a character who does smart things occasionally and silly baby things the rest of the time. Maggie is consistently the most competent person in any room she occupies, operating silently, invisibly, below everyone's threshold of observation, accomplishing things that the show's adult characters cannot manage while the adults are busy not paying attention to the baby. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly on at least one occasion. The results registered as extraordinary, off the charts by whatever measure was being applied, beyond what the standard instruments could accurately quantify. The show presents this as a quick joke and moves on. But the joke is consistent with everything else the show has shown you about Maggie. She is not an unusually smart baby. She is operating at a cognitive level that has no meaningful precedent in the context of her age. And she does not speak. Here is where the theory becomes something more than a collection of impressive moments. Maggie's first word, documented in a famous cameo by Elizabeth Taylor, was "Daddy." She said it once. The moment was treated as a significant event within the episode, and then it never happened again. Maggie has gone through 36 years of the show without developing language in any meaningful or sustained way. She is surrounded by a family of exceptionally verbal people. Homer narrates his own thoughts out loud. Marge processes her anxieties verbally and at length. Bart is essentially a constant stream of provocations and reactions. Lisa delivers speeches. The Simpson household is one of the loudest environments you could imagine. It is a wall of noise, constant and unrelenting. And in the middle of it, Maggie sits in complete silence, watching, listening, processing. The theory that most compellingly explains this is also the one that makes her the most interesting character in the show. Maggie does not speak because she has made a strategic decision not to speak. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is brilliant, genuinely brilliant, with an IQ that exceeds every adult in her household and most of the adults in Springfield. And what does that intelligence produce in her life? Isolation, dismissal, the particular loneliness of being the smartest person in a room full of people who resent the reminder. Lisa raises her hand and gets ignored. Lisa identifies a problem and gets told she is overthinking it. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and is resisted by a community that does not want to be improved, that experiences the suggestion of improvement as an accusation. Lisa's intelligence is her defining quality and her greatest source of pain because she wears it openly. She announces it. She cannot help but announce it because she has not yet learned the lesson that Maggie has apparently already absorbed. Maggie watched this happen. She has been watching it since she was born, which is to say she has been watching it for her entire life. She has seen her older sister fight every day for recognition and receive almost nothing in return. She has watched the most perceptive and capable member of her family be consistently overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed by people who should know better. And Maggie, sitting in her high chair with her enormous eyes taking in everything and her pacifier in her mouth and her silence around her like a cloak, drew a conclusion. Silence is armor. Invisibility is protection. The less you are noticed, the more you can accomplish. And the most effective disguise available to a child of extraordinary intelligence, living in a family and a community that punishes extraordinary intelligence, is to look exactly like what everyone expects you to be. A baby. Helpless, passive, dependent, requiring care and attention but not capable of providing any in return. The baby is the one member of any family who is never suspected. The baby is the one person in any room who is never watched closely enough to be caught at anything. The baby is the perfect cover, and Maggie has been using that cover for 36 years. Every remarkable thing she does, it happens below the radar. The Burns shooting was attributed to chance and infant reflexes rather than intent. The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody monitors infants closely enough to see them organizing. Every act of heroism, every display of strategic thinking, every moment where Maggie is the reason her family survives something, it happens in the margins, in the background, in the spaces where the adults are not looking, because Maggie arranged it that way. Now connect this to the radiation theory, because the connection is striking. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates biological mutations, and if those mutations affect different individuals in different ways, depending on their particular biological response to radiation exposure, then Homer and Maggie represent the two extreme poles of what that contamination produces in a single family. Homer's mutation reduced his intelligence to a clinical disability. The same contamination, the same water, the same air, the same decades of exposure that produced a man who functions at an IQ of 55, produced in his youngest daughter something at the opposite extreme, a mind so amplified by whatever the radiation did to her developing neural architecture that it cannot be accurately measured by instruments designed to quantify normal human intelligence. Homer and Maggie are two ends of the same spectrum, the father whose brain was taken from him by the environment, the daughter whose brain was given something extraordinary by that same environment, the same poison, producing opposite results in the same family, 2 generations apart. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius takes on an emotional dimension that is almost unbearable to contemplate. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since season 4 is the product of an unconscious mind trying to hold on to its family, then Maggie's extraordinary capabilities are Homer's deepest wish for his youngest child projected onto the dream. He cannot see her grow up. He cannot watch her become whoever she is going to become. He cannot hear her first real sentences or see her walk without falling or learn what kind of person she is becoming. He missed all of it, lying in a hospital bed. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that exceeds anyone's ability to fully comprehend. He makes her capable of doing things that no real baby could do. He makes her indestructible in the ways that matter, even if her body keeps betraying her with the limitations of an infant's motor skills. Because in the coma, Homer needs to know that Maggie will be okay even without him there. He needs to believe that the smallest and most vulnerable member of his family has something inside her that is going to carry her through whatever comes. Her genius in this reading is not a mutation and not a mystery. It is a father's prayer, compressed into a cartoon baby who never speaks and never ages and never stops watching from behind those enormous eyes. But even setting the coma theory aside, the question of what Maggie is waiting for remains one of the show's most genuinely unresolved threads. She has been building towards something. The silence is not passive. The invisibility is not accidental. She has been observing, planning, accumulating knowledge about every person and every system in Springfield for 36 years. And the show has never told us what she intends to do with all of it. She is 1 year old. She cannot walk reliably. She cannot sustain a conversation. She has shot a man, organized an infant rebellion, outwitted daycare security systems, and saved her family from danger so many times that the family has stopped noticing. Behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate and strategic silence, something is thinking. Something is watching. Something is waiting for the moment when it is finally time to stop pretending to be just a baby. And when that moment comes, Springfield will not see it coming. Because Maggie designed it that way from the very beginning. The comparison between Lisa and Maggie is one of the most carefully embedded contrasts in the show, and it rewards attention because the contrast is not simply about intelligence, but about intelligence in context, about what happens when you are the most perceptive person in a room that does not want to be perceived. Lisa's intelligence has been the source of most of the pain in her life. Not because she is wrong about things, she is almost always right. She identifies problems correctly, assesses situations accurately, and reaches conclusions that are well-reasoned and well-supported. The show is consistent about this. Lisa's judgments are correct, and they are consistently ignored, dismissed, resisted, or resented by the people around her. She raises her hand in class and gets the answer right, and her classmates find her exhausting. She identifies a community problem and encounters organized resistance from people who experience the advocacy as implicit criticism of their choices. She is the smartest person in the room, and the room responds by making sure she knows how little that matters. Maggie watched this happen. She watched her sister fight every day for recognition and receive nothing but resistance. She watched the smartest person in the family be consistently overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed by a household and a community that rewards compliance and punishes insight. And Maggie learned the lesson that Lisa never learned. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. Think about it. Every time Maggie does something remarkable, what happens? The family does not notice. The community does not notice. The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody monitors infants closely enough to see them organizing. Every heroic act, every display of intelligence, every moment where Maggie saves the day, it happens below the radar, in the spaces where nobody is paying attention. and Maggie has ensured that nobody pays attention to her by maintaining the most effective disguise possible. There is also a reading of Maggie's situation that connects her directly to the radiation theory. If the contamination from the plant affects biology in ways that are not uniform across individuals, the same environmental cause can produce radically different outcomes in different people. Homer's outcome was cognitive impairment. His intelligence was reduced. Maggie's outcome was the opposite. The contamination, interacting with whatever particular biological susceptibility she brought to it, amplified rather than diminished. Homer and Maggie are the poles of what the contamination does to the Simpson family. He represents the worst case in one direction. She represents something in the opposite direction that the show has never fully named. Between them, Bart and Lisa occupy the middle range, affected but not at the extremes, carrying the marks of the contamination without reaching the dramatic endpoints that Homer and Maggie represent. This reading adds something to the sadness of Homer's situation. If Maggie's extraordinary intelligence is in some sense a product of the same contamination that reduced Homer's, then Homer's impairment and Maggie's capacity are not simply opposite ends of a spectrum. They are two manifestations of the same wound. The contamination gave something to one Simpson child that it took from another. The plant's legacy in the family is not uniform damage. It is damage and gift, reduction and amplification, occurring in the same family, in the same house, on the same contaminated street. Homer cannot access the intelligence he was born with. Maggie has an intelligence she should not be able to access at 12 months of age. Both things are the plant's doing, and neither Homer nor Maggie will ever have the full version of themselves that the plant did not get to. The Daycare Rebellion, The Longest Daycare, the Academy Award-nominated theatrical short, rewards watching as a document of Maggie's operational approach, rather than simply as an entertaining animation. The mission she sets herself is not forced on her. She is not responding to a direct threat to herself. She identifies a situation, a caterpillar that Gerald the bully intends to destroy, assesses it as requiring intervention, and chooses to intervene. This is an elective mission. She could ignore Gerald. She could observe without acting. The caterpillar is not her caterpillar. The outcome is not directly relevant to her safety or well-being. She intervenes anyway, because the situation is wrong and she has the capacity to change it, and she decides that capacity is sufficient reason to act. This is not an infant response. This is not an instinctual response. This is an ethical response, a response that requires a moral framework that recognizes the caterpillar as having interests worth protecting and that places value on protecting those interests even at personal cost. The personal cost is significant. What Maggie does to protect the caterpillar requires her to navigate an unfamiliar physical environment, to deceive adult authority figures, to outmaneuver a physically larger antagonist, and to execute a multi-stage plan against active opposition. She does all of this with a 1-year-old's body. She falls down, she crawls, she has the physical limitations that are genuine at her developmental stage, but she compensates for them through planning, through the anticipation of obstacles before she reaches them, and through an adaptive flexibility that adjusts her plan in real time as circumstances change. The intelligence required to do this is not remarkable for a sophisticated adult. For a 12-month-old infant, it is not possible. Developmental psychology is fairly specific about what is cognitively available at different ages. 12-month-olds do not run multi-stage deception operations against authority figures in service of the interests of an unrelated organism. 12-month-olds are still working on object permanence. Maggie is working on something considerably more complex, and she is doing it without any of the developmental scaffolding that would ordinarily be required. No language, no extended prior experience of navigating complex social environments, no history of being educated about the principles she is applying. She arrives at them through whatever process her particular cognitive architecture uses, and she applies them with the precision of someone who has been practicing this kind of thinking for considerably longer than the 12 months the calendar assigns her. This is the most honest portrait the show has ever given you of what Maggie actually is. Not the pacifier, not the large eyes, not the comedic falls and the cute sounds and the family favorite background presence. The 7 minutes of The Longest Daycare. The mission, the planning, the execution, the success. The baby who cannot walk reliably running a covert operation in an unfamiliar building because something was wrong and she decided to fix it. That is Maggie Simpson. That is who has been sitting in the high chair for 36 years. Watching everything. Waiting. Section 6. The Principal and the Pauper. Springfield's collective denial. Breathe easy. Let your body rest completely. There is no pressure here tonight, nothing you need to do or hold on to or figure out. Just Springfield, and the slow unraveling of the things this town has agreed not to notice. The theory we are exploring in this section is the one that explains something the previous theories only partially address. Not what is happening to Springfield, but how Springfield manages to keep existing in spite of what is happening to it. How a town with a three-eyed fish in its river and a glowing billionaire in its woods and a baby who shot the richest man in town can simply continue on, week after week, episode after episode, as though none of it ever happened. The answer is provided, in the most direct and explicit terms the show has ever used, by Season 9, Episode 2. An episode that aired on September 28, 1997, and immediately generated one of the most sustained negative reactions in the show's history. The Principal and the Pauper. The episode is consistently ranked among the worst in the series. It has been cited by fans for nearly 3 decades as the moment the show stopped caring about its own internal consistency. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner and many other Springfield characters, has publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline it introduced. Critics called it a betrayal of the character they thought they knew. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary is hosting a ceremony honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service. The school, the staff, the community are gathered to celebrate the man they know. And a stranger walks in. He is a man nobody recognizes, an older man with a military bearing and a name that matches the principal's exactly. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, United States Army, a decorated Vietnam veteran, a prisoner of war, believed killed in action, who survived and escaped and came home after 2 decades to find that someone else had been living as him. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner is not Seymour Skinner. His name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, he was a street criminal, a petty offender from a difficult background with no future and no clear path forward. He was drafted into the army and served alongside the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian carried the guilt of surviving when his friend did not. He traveled to Springfield to inform Agnes Skinner, the principal's elderly and formidable mother, that her son was gone. But when he arrived, Agnes saw what she needed to see. She needed her son. She needed him to have come back. And Tamzarian, who had never in his life been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or an identity worth preserving, simply allowed her assumption to stand. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the relationships, the mother who had never been his. He built a life inside a stolen identity and lived inside it for 20 years, until the real Skinner walked through the door and the whole construction collapsed in a school auditorium in front of the entire community. Now here's the part the show's critics focus on, understandably. Springfield knows the truth. Everyone in the episode knows the truth. The real Skinner is standing right there. The imposter is standing right there. The evidence is complete and undeniable. There is nothing ambiguous about the situation. And Springfield holds a vote, not about what to do with the imposter, not about how to make the real Skinner whole, a vote about whether to acknowledge the truth at all, and the result is unanimous. The town chooses the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree establishing that Armin Tamzarian is the real Seymour Skinner. The name and identity and history are his by official municipal decree. The actual Seymour Skinner, the man who served in Vietnam and survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life stolen, is physically removed from Springfield. He is tied to a railroad car and expelled from the community. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention what actually happened again. The town voted to make truth illegal, not metaphorically, through an actual legal mechanism presided over by an actual judge, enforced by the institutional power of the community. The truth was expelled, and the comfortable lie was given the force of law. This is why the fans were so angry. They read it as careless writing, as the show throwing away years of established character in a single episode for a gag that did not land. And they are not wrong that it creates significant continuity problems. If Skinner is not Skinner, if his relationship with Agnes, his military history, his dynamic with Bart, all of it is built on a fiction, then what happens to everything the show established about him before this episode? But here is what the critics missed, or at least what they chose not to engage with. The episode is not careless. The episode is ruthlessly honest about what Springfield actually is, because Springfield has always worked this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed, collectively and without formal acknowledgement, to forget whatever does not fit the narrative that makes life there manageable. The only thing different about the principal and the pauper is that this episode shows you the mechanism operating in plain sight. It shows you the vote. It shows you the legal decree. It shows you the physical expulsion of the truth from the community's boundaries. Every other time Springfield forgets something catastrophic, something impossible, something that should permanently alter the town's understanding of itself, it happens off-screen. Between episodes, in the space where continuity would otherwise live. The contamination of the water supply, forgotten by next week. The government sealing the town under a dome, reset. The multiple occasions when some portion of Springfield has been destroyed or invaded or fundamentally altered. Back to normal. By the opening of the following episode, the town has always had this capacity. It has always been able to digest and eliminate uncomfortable realities with remarkable efficiency. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode that lets you watch it happen in real time. And once you see it for what it is, every other impossible reset in the show's history becomes not lazy writing but evidence of the same mechanism operating with its usual invisibility. Springfield forgets because Springfield chooses to forget. The forgetting is not passive. It is not the natural result of time passing or attention shifting. It is an active, collective, deliberate choice made by a community that has learned, through long experience, that acknowledging certain truths leads to consequences nobody can afford. Think through the chain of consequences if Springfield could not forget. If they remembered the dome, they would have to acknowledge the environmental contamination. If they acknowledged the contamination, they would have to confront the power plant. If they confronted the power plant, they would have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns successfully, his economic hold on the town would collapse, the plant would close, the jobs would disappear, the town's sole significant employer would be gone. And Springfield, which has no apparent economic base beyond the power plant and the various small businesses that exist to serve the plant's workers, would die. So they forget. They vote to forget. They make forgetting the community standard, the expected behavior, the thing that a reasonable citizen of Springfield does with information that would otherwise require action. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He arrived with complete, undeniable evidence that the official narrative was false. And the community's response was not gratitude for the truth. It was not even measured consideration of how to proceed honestly. It was immediate, unanimous, legally formalized rejection of the truth and physical removal of the person who carried it. That is not a comedy beat, though the show plays it with the familiar rhythms of comedy. That is the show describing, in precise mechanical detail, the system by which Springfield maintains its impossible reality. The system that makes the floating timeline possible. The system that allows the contamination to continue. The system that keeps Burns in power and Homer in Sector 7G and the three-eyed fish in the river and nobody asking the questions that the situation demands. Collective denial, not the passive kind. The organized, formalized, legally enforced kind that criminalizes inquiry and exiles the people who insist on conducting it. And now add the coma theory, because the combination is darker than either one alone. If Homer is dreaming, if everything since the Season 4 coma episode is the product of a deteriorating unconscious mind generating simulation after simulation of its preferred reality, then the Principal and the Pauper is Homer's dreaming brain inventing a scenario in which an entire community votes to sustain a lie, because that is exactly what Homer needs to believe is possible. Homer needs to believe that stolen identities can become real through collective agreement, that the fake version of a life can replace the true one and hold, indefinitely, as long as nobody with enough authority to enforce the fiction has a reason to abandon it. He needs to believe this because his own coma is precisely that, a fake life replacing a real one, a dream standing in for waking existence, a simulation that has been running for over 3 decades, maintained by the dreaming brain of a man who chose the comfortable fog over the unbearable clarity of what is actually true. As long as Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction, Homer does not have to wake up. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. It is the most important one. It is the one episode that stops being coy about the machinery underneath the comedy. The one episode that walks you directly to the room where the control systems live, opens the door, and lets you look inside. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. the town is still pretending to believe him. And somewhere out there, tied to a train and expelled from his own name and history, is the last honest man Springfield ever produced. The town made honesty illegal, and the law has held ever since. The Armin Tamzarian situation, examined as a social and institutional phenomenon rather than as a narrative decision about a single character, reveals something about how communities maintain their collective identity under pressure that the show's critics missed entirely in their immediate response to the episode. What Springfield faced when the real Seymour Skinner walked through the door was not simply a question of which man should occupy the principal's office. It was a question about the nature of identity itself and about what a community owes to truth when truth becomes destabilizing. Armin Tamzarian had been Seymour Skinner for 20 years. 20 years of staff meetings and detention slips and parent-teacher conferences and interactions with hundreds of students who grew up under his authority. The institutional memory of Springfield Elementary, across a generation of students and staff, was built around a person who did not exist in exactly the form that memory described. When the real Skinner appeared, the choice Springfield faced was between two concrete and costly outcomes. Acknowledge the truth, which would mean acknowledging that the authority figure who had shaped a generation of educational experience was operating under a false identity, and then deal with all the implications of that acknowledgement. Or maintain the established identity, which would mean choosing the functional reality of 20 years of relationships and institutional history over the technical reality of a man's legal name. Springfield chose the functional reality. This is not insane. Communities make this kind of choice constantly, in less dramatic but structurally similar forms. The community whose beloved founding story turns out to be historically inaccurate does not typically dismantle the story. The institution whose mythology has been built around a particular version of events does not typically invite comprehensive revision of that mythology. What made Springfield's choice extraordinary was not the choice itself, but the explicitness of it. Springfield voted. It made the choice consciously, formally, in a room with all the relevant parties present. It passed a legal decree. It expelled the representative of the truth that was being rejected. Most communities make the same choice in the same informal, undeclared way that Springfield makes most of its decisions, which is to say quietly, without formal process, through the accumulated weight of everyone simply not raising the inconvenient question until enough time has passed that the question becomes practically unanswerable. Springfield skipped the quiet part. It had the vote in public, and the audience recoiled from the visibility, not from the choice. From seeing the choice being made explicitly in a meeting with a legal decree so that everyone could see it clearly and then decide whether to absorb it or to look directly at what it was showing them. The episode did not make Springfield do something that real communities do not do. It made visible the thing that real communities do constantly. And the visibility was what produced the discomfort. The real Seymour Skinner was tied to a railroad car and sent away. The truth was expelled. The comfortable lie was decreed true. And Springfield went back to normal. Just like it always does. Just like every community does. In one form or another, when the truth becomes too expensive to accommodate. The mechanism that the principal and the pauper exposes is most clearly understood when you consider what it costs to tell the truth in Springfield versus what it costs to maintain the comfortable alternative. The real Seymour Skinner was a war hero. He survived imprisonment. He came home. By any conventional standard of how communities treat people who have endured what he endured in service of their country, his return should have been welcomed. His identity should have been restored. The man who had been living his life for 20 years should have been unmasked, prosecuted if appropriate, and at minimum removed from the position he had been occupying fraudulently. Instead, he was tied to a train. The message Springfield sent, through its vote and its legal decree and its physical ejection of the truth, is one that every resident of the town had already internalized to some degree through living there. The message is, if you show up here carrying an uncomfortable fact about the way things are, you will not find gratitude. You will find a community that has already decided the fact is too expensive, and that will deal with the expense by dealing with you. This is not unique to Springfield. Every community has this mechanism available to it. Every community has used this mechanism in some form. The whistleblower who discovers something damaging and brings it forward does not universally receive the protection and the gratitude that the culture nominally promises them. They often receive what the real Seymour Skinner received, which is organized resistance from the institutions and the people who benefit from the way things are and who have much more to lose from the truth than they have to gain. The Principal and the Pauper is Springfield making this explicit. It is the show taking the mechanism that every community uses and presenting it in undeniable form, the formal vote, the legal decree, the physical expulsion, so that the audience can see exactly what they have been looking at in the background of every other episode where Springfield forgets something important or absorbs something catastrophic and continues as though nothing significant occurred. The real Seymour Skinner is also, in a specific sense, every Blinky, every three-eyed fish, every safety inspection report, every piece of evidence that the plant's contamination has done something to Springfield that Springfield would have to change fundamentally to address. All of those things are truths that Springfield has expelled from its official reality, not with a formal vote and a legal decree, but with the informal and cumulative equivalent. The quiet consensus that this is not something we discuss. The shared understanding that this is not a question we pursue. The gentle collective pressure that redirects attention from the uncomfortable toward the comfortable. The Principal and the Pauper just made the expulsion formal, so you could see it happen. Whether you chose to see it, or whether you filed it under bad episode and moved on, that was your version of the vote. Section 7 Mona Simpson and the Burns Conspiracy. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the narrative continue to wash over you slowly, the way a good story does when you are half asleep, finding its way into memory through the softer channels. Because this next section is the one that reframes Homer Simpson entirely. Not as a bumbling cartoon father whose incompetence is the source of comedy, but as a man whose entire life was shaped by someone else's decision before he was old enough to understand what was being done to him. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was the established fact of his backstory. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told him this. He showed Homer a grave. Homer believed it. He grew up carrying the particular weight of maternal loss, the kind that reshapes a child's understanding of themselves in ways that can take decades to trace. It explains so much about Homer that fans sometimes overlook because it is so foundational. His desperate need for validation, his clinginess toward Marge, which the show depicts as love, but which also has the quality of someone who has never been fully certain that the people he loves will stay. His compulsive need to be liked by everyone around him. His willingness to endure humiliation and dismissal from Burns without quitting, because the alternative, being without the stability his job provides, feels more frightening than the humiliation. Homer Simpson's entire personality is, at its core, a coping mechanism for a loss that he experienced in childhood and never fully processed. And in Season 7, the show revealed that the loss was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November of 1995. Homer, through a sequence of events that begins with him faking his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, ends up at the Hall of Records correcting the paperwork that has officially listed him as deceased. While there, he discovers something in the municipal records. His mother is alive. She is not dead. The grave Abe showed him was not hers. It is the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been pointing Homer at a famous writer's headstone for Homer's entire life and letting him believe it was his mother's. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting the grave she believes belongs to her son, the grave created by Homer's own staged death earlier in the episode. The reunion that follows, a grown man and his mother separated for 27 years meeting in a cemetery beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them, is one of the most genuinely emotional scenes the show has ever produced. Not played for comedy, not undercut by a gag, just 2 people who lost each other finding each other again. And then Mona tells Homer why she left. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She did not leave because she chose to. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who owned Springfield's nuclear power plant, the man Homer would grow up to work for without ever knowing the connection, had destroyed her life and forced her into exile. Here is the story she tells. In 1969, Mona Simpson was a housewife. She had a husband, a young son, a quiet life in Springfield, and then something shifted. The world outside was burning with protest and counterculture, and the particular urgency of a moment when people believed that individual action could still change the direction of large systems. Mona was radicalized. The show depicts this with its characteristic mixture of affection and comedy, and she joined a group of activists who targeted a specific facility. Not the nuclear power plant, something considerably more alarming. a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that settle. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations. He owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory in Springfield, the same town where Homer was growing up, designed to produce weaponized biological agents. Burns was manufacturing pathogens in a lab located in the same community where he was also running a leaking nuclear reactor and dumping radioactive waste onto children's playgrounds. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agents stored inside the facility. During their escape, in a moment of moral instinct that would cost her everything, Mona stopped to help someone who had fallen during the chaos. That someone was Burns. She helped the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. She stopped her escape to assist the man who was her target, because whatever her convictions about what he was doing, she could not leave an injured person on the ground. And Burns looked up, and Burns saw her face. And Burns, who has a memory as long as his lifespan and a capacity for grudges that appears to exceed both, identified her, reported her to the FBI, and set in motion the sequence that would define the rest of her life. From that moment, Mona was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not hold her son or explain anything to him. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping, and she disappeared. Homer was a young child. He woke up and his mother was gone. His father told him she had died, and Homer spent the next 3 decades believing that he was the kind of son a mother would rather leave than raise. Believing there was something fundamentally wrong with him that made people go away. Now here is where the conspiracy takes shape beyond the obvious. Burns did not just identify Mona to the FBI and let the government handle it. He pursued her, actively, personally, across decades. The show establishes in the Season 7 episode that when Mona finally returns to Springfield, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a cab window, a fleeting glimpse, and he calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time in his life, this time with the full knowledge of why she is going and who is responsible. Burns held a personal grudge against a woman who destroyed his weapons lab for over 2 decades and deployed his resources and connections to ensure she could never return to her family. And Homer, throughout all of this, continues to work for Burns. He continues to collect his paycheck from the man who stole his mother from him. He continues to go in every morning, sit down at his console, and spend his days in the employment of the person most directly responsible for the shape his life has taken. And Homer does not connect these things. The show does not play this as Homer being too proud to quit or too principled to confront Burns. Homer simply does not make the connection. His brain does not move from point A to point B, in the chain of causation that leads from Burns to Mona's exile, to Homer's childhood, to his adult psychology. The dots are all there. He has all the information. He just cannot assemble it into a picture. And this is where the radiation theory and the Burns conspiracy theory merge into something deeply unsettling. Homer's inability to make this connection is not personality, it is neurology. His cognitive function has been compromised by decades of living in Springfield's contaminated environment, by working in direct proximity to an active and leaking reactor, by the crayon that spent most of his childhood and all of his adult life embedded in his brain tissue, and the medical establishment of Springfield that never removed it. Burns broke Homer as a child by taking his mother. Then Burns employed Homer as an adult in conditions that ensured the cognitive damage from Homer's upbringing would continue and deepen. And the broken Homer, the damaged and compliant and desperately grateful Homer, is exactly the kind of employee Burns requires. Someone who will not ask questions. Someone who will not make connections. Someone who will not walk into Burns's office and say, "I know what you did to my mother, and I know what this plant is doing to this town, and I am done." A competent, psychologically intact Homer with a functional understanding of his own history would be a disaster for Burns's operation. A Homer who grew up with his mother, who was loved and secure and neurologically unimpaired, who never needed the job at the plant with the particular desperate clinginess of someone for whom employment is the closest thing to family stability, would have left years ago. Burns needed Homer broken. And Burns broke him before Homer was old enough to understand what was happening. The show later reveals a second layer of this architecture, a deal between Burns and Grandpa Simpson. Burns had committed a crime. Grandpa discovered it. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant, no matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how catastrophic his negligence, no matter how many times he created situations that should have resulted in immediate termination. 742 documented errors and still employed. Homer's job security, the one stable thing in his professional life that allows him to support his family and maintain the structure his psychology requires, was not a product of his own performance or Burns's oversight. It was a contractual obligation between his father and his mother's persecutor, negotiated in private, maintained in secrecy, and never explained to Homer because explaining it would mean explaining everything else. 3 generations of Simpsons, shaped by one man's grudge and one town's inability to challenge the power that destroyed them. Mona, who fought back and lost everything. Abe, who made a deal with the man who drove his wife away and buried the truth in exchange for his son's employment. Homer, who inherited the consequences of all of it and never understood why his life felt the way it did. Burns won. In this dimension of the show, Burns always won. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. The man with the money controls the water and the air and the medical establishment and the economy and the employment and the cognitive function of every person whose paycheck comes from the plant. Homer's mother fought him. She fought him with an antibiotic bomb in a germ warfare lab in 1969, and she was right to fight him, and she was defeated anyway. Not because her cause was wrong, but because you cannot win against someone who owns the town you live in, the water you drink, the air you breathe, and the doctor who could have told Homer about the crayon in his head but chose not to. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The scene is not played for comedy. Homer is beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away, and the weight of 27 stolen years sits in the room with both of them. No gag, no reset, just a man and his mother and the inventory of everything that was taken from them by one old man who held a grudge longer than most people live. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy, but underneath the jokes, threaded through 36 seasons of Homer falling down and getting back up, there is this. A story about a family systematically dismantled by a single concentrated source of power, and the way the damage from that dismantling propagated through generations in forms that nobody inside the family could fully see or name. Burns still signs Homer's check. Homer still drives to the plant every morning. The house on Evergreen Terrace still runs on electricity generated by the reactor that poisoned its occupants' water supply. And Mona is gone. The biological weapons laboratory is the element of Mona's story that most people, even people who know the Mother Simpson episode well, tend to absorb without fully processing. Burns built a germ warfare facility in Springfield. Not in some remote location. In Springfield, the town where Homer was growing up. The town where families were raising children. Burns was manufacturing weaponized biological agents in the same community where he was also running a nuclear reactor with 342 safety violations. The show presents this as backstory, historical context for Mona's radicalization and the events of 1969. But the biological weapons laboratory is worth sitting with. Burns was not just a negligent energy executive willing to cut corners on nuclear safety for profit. He was operating a facility designed to produce weapons in a residential community while simultaneously running the nuclear facility that was already contaminating that community's water supply. Mona saw this. She joined people who were also not willing to simply accept it, and they destroyed the weapons. The raid was successful, and Mona stopped to help an injured person on the way out. The person she helped was Burns. And Burns used the moment of her help to memorize her face and spend the next 2 decades making sure she could never come home. The act that destroyed Mona's life was an act of compassion. Not the raid, the stopping. The turning toward an injured person when turning away was the safer and more strategically sound choice. She helped the person who would spend decades hunting her for it. The deal between Abe Simpson and Mr. Burns adds another layer. Grandpa had leverage over Burns, real leverage. Most people in Springfield have no leverage over Burns. Most people in the world have no leverage over someone in Burns's position. Grandpa had it, and he used that leverage to secure his son's permanent employment. Not to expose Burns, not to extract remediation for what the plant had done to the community, not to demand accountability for the biological weapons laboratory that Mona had risked everything to disable. He used his singular point of leverage over the most powerful man in Springfield to guarantee that Homer would always have a job at the plant that was poisoning Springfield. The exchange is heartbreaking when you look at it clearly. The cruelty of it, the specific and painful irony, is that the job Grandpa secured for Homer is the job at the plant that is poisoning Homer. The employment guarantee is employment in the facility that contaminates the water Homer drinks and the air Homer breathes. Grandpa traded Burns' accountability to the community for Homer's right to continue being exposed to what Burns is doing to the community. Homer will always have a job at the plant, and the plant will always have Homer, and Burns will always have his monopoly, his freedom from consequence, and his empire over a town full of people whose grandparents had moments when they could have made different choices, and who chose, when those moments arrived, the safety of the familiar arrangement over the danger of the truth. Homer choosing the crayon is the moment in the show's history that most directly tests the contamination theory's claim that the damage to Springfield's population is not incapacitating in the absolute sense, but is specifically targeted at the capacities required to recognize and respond to the damage. When the crayon is removed, Homer functions. He functions well. He is intelligent, articulate, funny in a different way than Foggy. Homer is funny and genuinely capable of understanding the world he inhabits. He goes to work. He engages with his family. He has the conversations that Foggy Homer cannot have. He makes the connections that Foggy Homer cannot make. And he is miserable. The misery is not philosophical. It is not the misery of an intellectual who has risen above the pleasures available to ordinary life and finds them insufficient. It is the specific misery of someone who can suddenly see their situation clearly and who cannot unsee it. Who looks at the nuclear plant and sees the violations. Who looks at Burns and sees the history. Who looks at his own life and sees the accumulated weight of decades of cognitive fog and what that fog has cost him, in opportunities and in understanding, and in the life he might have been able to build if he had been able to think clearly throughout it. That clarity is unbearable, not because Homer is weak, because the clarity is accurate. The things he sees when he can see clearly are the things that are actually there. The plant is as broken as he can now see it is. Burns is as culpable as he can now assess him to be. His own situation is as shaped by forces operating against his interests as he can now understand it to be. The fog was not just comfortable. In the specific environment of Springfield, it was protective. The cognitive impairment that the contamination produced is, from a certain angle, the only psychological condition that makes living in Springfield sustainable without constant consuming grief. Homer chose the crayon back. This is the most honest moment the show has ever had about what the contamination does to the people it affects. It does not just impair them. It protects them from having to clearly see what they are impaired from seeing. The fog and the damage and the four-fingered, yellow-skinned, impossible life in the contaminated zone are a package deal. You cannot have the clarity without losing the anesthesia. And for a man in Homer's situation, a man with Homer's history and Homer's structural position in a system designed to keep him exactly where he is, clarity without the capacity to change anything that clarity reveals might genuinely be the worse option. He chose the fog, and the show did not condemn him for it. The show understood it. The show has always understood it. Springfield is not a happy place in the clear light of honest examination. Springfield is survivable primarily because most of its residents cannot sustain the honest examination long enough to understand what there is to survive. Homer understood this, briefly, in full cognitive clarity, and then he made the choice that the understanding made available to him. He went back to the fog, where the beer tastes good and the family is whole and the plant's cracked cooling towers are just background texture in the life of a man who does not look at cooling towers very hard and has never particularly needed to. Section 8. The Predictions Phenomenon. Settle in now. Let everything else go quiet. This next section is a different kind of story, less dark than what came before, but strange in its own way. The strangeness of a show that seems to know things it should not know. That seems to see things coming before they arrive. That seems, to the people who share its clips on social media every time a headline matches something from a 1997 episode, to be operating slightly outside the normal relationship between fiction and reality. The Simpsons prediction phenomenon. You have almost certainly encountered this. A clip circulates showing a scene from a decades-old episode that depicts something that has just happened in the real world. The caption is always a variation on the same theme. The Simpsons predicted this. How did they know? and the clip gets shared tens of thousands of times by people who find the correspondence genuinely uncanny. Let us start with the most famous example, because it sets the template for everything else. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a possible future for the Simpson family. Lisa, as an adult, has become president of the United States. Her administration is inheriting a budget crisis from her predecessor. Her predecessor's administration is identified, in passing, as the Trump presidency. Donald Trump, the episode establishes, was president of the United States at some point before Lisa's story begins. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the election of 2016. When the result of that election became clear, the clip from Bart to the Future went everywhere. Screenshots, video clips, commentary pieces. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in 20 years suddenly found themselves watching a 16-year-old scene about a cartoon family's future and experiencing something that felt like encountering a prophecy. The response was widespread enough and sustained enough that it became a genuine cultural reference point. The Simpsons predicted Trump became a shorthand for a certain kind of uncanny cultural premonition. And that is only the beginning of the list. In 1995, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that functioned as a portable communication and computation tool. The visual design of the device is recognizable to anyone who has ever worn a smartwatch. The episode aired well over a decade before the first consumer smartwatches reached the market. In 1994, Homer accompanies NASA astronaut Buzz Aldrin on a space mission, decades before commercial space tourism became a serious industry, with real passengers and real rockets. In 1998, Homer discovers a mathematical equation on a chalkboard that, when examined by people with the relevant expertise, turns out to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle. The Higgs boson was experimentally confirmed in 2012 at the Large Hadron Collider. The show had the number 14 years earlier, in a background detail on a chalkboard in a scene that most viewers never looked at closely. In 1999, Homer proposes a theory that the universe is shaped like a donut, a torus, rather than a sphere. Years after the episode aired, cosmological research analyzing radiation patterns in the cosmic microwave background produced results consistent with a toroidal universe geometry. In 1993, an episode called Margin Chains depicts a flu virus originating in Asia that spreads to Springfield, causing widespread illness, mass panic, a collapse of normal social behavior, and a frantic community response that includes panic buying and the desperate search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic, and during the chaos of the fictional outbreak, Springfield's panicking residents accidentally release a swarm of killer bees, which felt particularly strange when Asian giant hornets, nicknamed murder hornets by the media, appeared in the United States in the actual spring of 2020. In 1996, an episode featured a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. That exact event happened in 2024, when Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall, 28 years between the joke and the reality. In 1998, the show depicted the Walt Disney Company acquiring 20th Century Fox. Disney completed that acquisition in 2019. The list continues at length. Video calling technology. Autocorrect failures presented as comedy in episodes from the 1990s that would not have made the same jokes in context without an audience that had experienced autocorrect. Surveillance culture. The particular ways that technology reshapes social behavior in ways that early episodes satirized before the technologies being satirized had fully arrived. The natural response to a list this long is to reach for a supernatural explanation. Time travel, secret foreknowledge. Some arrangement between the show's writers and institutions that have access to information the public does not. These explanations spread on social media because they are more interesting and more shareable than the real one. The real explanation, offered by the people who actually make the show, is considerably less exciting. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons for most of its run, addressed the prediction phenomenon with characteristic directness. His explanation: if you throw enough darts, some of them are going to hit bullseyes. That is it. That is the core of the official answer. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of satirical observations about the trajectory of American culture, technology, politics, and social behavior. When you generate that volume of content over that time span, statistical probability alone guarantees that some percentage of it will correspond to future events through coincidence. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, was equally direct. There are very few cases where The Simpsons predicted something. It is mainly coincidence because the episodes are so old and history has a tendency to repeat itself. That is the official internal position: coincidence, volume, and the cyclical nature of historical patterns. Fact-checking organizations have examined the most popular supposed predictions and found that the vast majority of them have simple explanations. The writers were observing trends that were already visible and extrapolating them to their logical conclusions. Trump had been publicly flirting with running for president since the 1980s. His name had been floated seriously enough that a writer in the year 2000 could include him in a list of plausible future candidates without it constituting a genuine prediction. The Disney-Fox merger was the extension of a media consolidation trend that industry observers had been discussing for years before it happened. The smartwatch episode depicted a technology that was already being developed by researchers and that the writers had presumably read about in technology coverage. The Simpsons writing room has historically been one of the most educated in American television. Many of its writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite academic institutions. Multiple members of the staff have backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, political theory, and various hard sciences. These are not people throwing random darts at a board. They are exceptionally well-read, intellectually rigorous observers of American culture and technology who spent their careers identifying trends, analyzing trajectories, and extrapolating current conditions to their absurd but logically consistent future states. They were not predicting the future. They were reading the present more carefully than most people do and then projecting it forward a few steps. Most of the predictions dissolve under this explanation. They were trend extrapolations by smart people who understood the direction things were heading, dressed in enough comedic exaggeration to make them feel like jokes at the time and feel like prophecies in retrospect. But the explanation does not account for all of them, and the ones it does not account for are the ones that keep nagging at you. The Trump prediction was not just that a celebrity might run for president. The episode specified Trump by name and depicted a detail, a descent via escalator in a public and ostentatious announcement, that mirrors with strange precision the visual staging of Trump's actual presidential announcement in June of 2015. These are not trend extrapolations. The escalator is a specific detail. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just joke about the danger of exotic animals. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of its trainers in a scene that corresponds closely to the actual event in 2003, when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers. An exotic animal attack is a trend extrapolation. A white tiger attacking a specific entertainer's performer is specific in a way that feels different. These coincidences are precise enough to produce genuine unease, even in people who fully understand the statistical argument. And this is where the most interesting theory about the predictions comes in. The one that is more intellectually satisfying than any conspiracy and more unsettling than any claim of supernatural foreknowledge. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes the future, not through magic and not through prophecy, through cultural influence. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in history. It has been running for longer than most of its current viewers have been alive. Its jokes and references have become part of the American cultural vocabulary. Its satirical observations have become part of how Americans process and understand the world they live in. When the show makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural conversation. Millions of people see it. It becomes something people reference when Trump appears in the news. It becomes part of the ambient cultural context within which Trump's actual political career develops. The joke does not predict the event. The joke makes the event feel familiar in advance. It primes the cultural imagination, makes the idea feel less like an impossible scenario and more like a possible punchline waiting for its setup. And when the punchline arrives in reality, the sensation is not surprise. It is recognition. We have seen this before. The Simpsons already put this in front of us. The show did not predict Disney buying Fox. The show made media consolidation feel like an obvious inevitability by satirizing it as already accomplished. When Disney actually made the acquisition, the cultural response was not shock. It was the resigned recognition of something that felt like it had been in motion for a long time. This is how cultural satire works at its most effective. It does not reflect the future. It normalizes the future in advance. It shows you where the logic of current trends leads and makes that destination feel familiar before you arrive there, so that when you arrive, the landscape is already known to you. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was going. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was. The nuclear power plant run by an uncountable billionaire for profit, maintained by underpaid workers who are too dependent on their jobs to question the conditions. The incompetent government captured by wealth. The population too distracted and too economically precarious to attend effectively to the systems that govern their lives. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset, in which disasters happen and produce temporary outrage and then are absorbed by the ordinary machinery of daily life. The show did not write this as a vision of the future. It wrote it as a portrait of the present, and it has been accurate for 36 years because the present it was describing has not fundamentally changed. And here is the final piece of the prediction phenomenon that the viral clips always omit. For every prediction that came true, there are dozens that did not. Jokes about jetpacks that never arrived. Political scenarios that went a different direction. Social developments that the show depicted as imminent and that never materialized. Technologies that the show described as coming and that have still not come. Nobody shares those clips. Nobody creates viral posts about the times The Simpsons got it wrong, because confirmation bias operates in one direction only. We remember the matches and discard the misses. When you produce 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about American culture, and then filter those observations through the most powerful confirmation bias amplifier in human history, which is the modern internet's capacity to surface, share, and retain only the content that produces maximum emotional engagement, you end up with a highlight reel of successful predictions that looks indistinguishable from prophecy. The Simpsons wrote so many possible futures that some of them were bound to come true, and the ones that came true are the only ones that anyone remembers. But try telling that to yourself the next time a clip from 1998 lines up with a headline from this morning in a way that makes you put down your phone and stare at nothing for a moment. Because even knowing the trick, even understanding the statistical argument, some of these correspondences are just precise enough to make you wonder if there is something else going on. Something that the writers themselves cannot fully account for. Something in the particular clarity of vision that comes from watching America from the specific angle that Springfield provides. For long enough, with enough intelligence and enough attention to see the shapes of things before they fully arrive. The cultural influence theory of the predictions, the idea that The Simpsons shapes the future rather than forecasting it by normalizing certain outcomes in advance, gains support from an unexpected direction when you consider how specific the predictions that resist the statistical explanation actually are. The Trump escalator, the white tiger, these are details that go beyond trend extrapolation into something that feels qualitatively different. But even these might yield to a more sophisticated version of the influence argument. Satire at its best does not just identify where things are going. It identifies the internal logic that governs how things develop, the underlying rules that produce outcomes, and then follows those rules to their conclusions. If you understand the logic well enough, you can predict not just general directions but specific forms, because the specific forms are the natural outputs of the logic you have understood. Someone who had deeply understood the logic of how Trump would announce a presidential campaign might arrive at the escalator not as a guess but as the natural output of that understanding. And the Simpsons writers at their best had exactly that kind of understanding of the cultural logic of the figures they satirized. They were not guessing, they were reasoning, following the logic of a cultural type to its natural formal expression. This is not prediction in the mystical sense. It is something closer to deep reading. There is also a version of the predictions phenomenon that does not get discussed as much as it deserves, which is the degree to which The Simpsons has predicted things that then did not come true, and what the existence of those failed predictions tells us about the successful ones. The show predicted jetpacks achieving widespread use. Jetpacks remain extremely niche. The show predicted specific political outcomes that went the other way. The show made observations about cultural trends that turned out to be reading the moment rather than the trajectory. The predictions that stand out as genuinely remarkable stand out because they stand out. They are the ones that get shared. The act of sharing them, organizing them into a coherent narrative about the show's prophetic capacity, is itself a process of selection that filters out everything that does not fit the narrative. What the predictions phenomenon ultimately does is make people pay attention. It makes people take seriously the observation that a show made decades ago about the direction American culture was heading. It makes people look at the Springfield nuclear power plant and the corrupt billionaire and the cognitively impaired population and see those things as comments on real dynamics rather than as comedy backdrop. The predictions are not prophecy, but the effect of believing they might be is that you start watching the show as though it might be saying something true about the world. And that is the correct way to watch The Simpsons. It has always been saying something true about the world. It has just been saying it inside comedy, where the truth can be received without producing the discomfort that the same truth delivered directly would produce. The Oracle story is wrong. The diagnosis story is right. And the Oracle story has been sending people toward the diagnosis story for decades, which may be the most useful thing about it. The show's most sophisticated engagement with the predictions phenomenon occurs not in any specific episode that happens to align with a future event, but in the cumulative portrait of American institutional life that the show has been building across its entire run. The corrupt local politician, the negligent regulator, the billionaire who operates beyond accountability, the media that sensationalizes rather than investigates, the community that is too distracted or too impaired or too economically dependent to organize effective resistance, the educational system that does not produce the kind of critical thinking that would threaten the arrangement, the legal system that is more accessible to money than to ordinary people. These are not satirical exaggerations. They are recognizable features of American institutional life that The Simpsons has been depicting in the slightly heightened register of animation since 1989. And they are more recognizable now than they were in 1989, not because the show predicted their development, but because the show was depicting something that was already true and that has become more visible over the subsequent decades. When The Simpsons seems to have predicted something about American political or institutional life, the more accurate description is usually that the show identified something real in 1990-something, and American reality subsequently moved in the direction of making that real thing more visible. The show was there first not because it could see the future, but because it was looking at the present clearly, in an era when the present was still easier to look at than directly. By the time a given Simpsons episode becomes topical, the thing it was satirizing has usually stopped being something that only careful satirists can see. It has become something that anyone paying attention can see. The show gets credit for prophetic vision when the real credit is for early clear-sightedness, for being the observer who noticed something true and recorded it before the general culture had quite caught up to what they were looking at. This is a form of intelligence. It is not prophecy. But it is intelligence applied to observation in a sustained and disciplined way over decades of production by a writing staff that took seriously the obligation to look at America clearly and to say, in the comedic register available to them, what they saw. The show wrote down what it saw. America eventually arrived at what it had always been becoming, and the show's archive contained a record of the journey that America could now look back on and call prediction. It was not prediction, it was documentation. The Simpsons documented American life in real time for 36 years. The documentation looks prophetic because the things it documented have not changed as much as you might hope, and the unchanged things look familiar when you encounter them in an archive from decades earlier. The Simpsons predicted the future by describing the present, year after year, in terms that remained accurate across the years that followed. That is not mystical. It is just what happens when you tell the truth for long enough. Section 9. Where is Springfield? The night is deep now. If you are still with me, you are somewhere in that comfortable haze between wakefulness and sleep, where stories continue to make sense even as the edges of consciousness soften. Stay there. This next section is a quieter mystery than the ones before it, but it is one that connects to all of them. Where is Springfield? Not which state it is in, because that question has been asked and dodged and answered and contradicted for 36 years. The real question is why. Why has the show spent its entire run making this question impossible to definitively answer? Why did it spend 3 decades building an elaborate tapestry of geographic contradiction, suggesting Ohio in one episode and Maine in another and Nevada in a third, giving it coastline and mountains and desert and farmland simultaneously, describing it as bordering states that do not share a border, placing it near Mexico and near Canada in different episodes? What is the purpose of a town that cannot be located? Let us start with what we know for certain. Springfield has an ocean. It also has mountains. It also has a desert within what appears to be day trip distance. It has farmland. It has a forest. It has a gorge. It has a tire fire that has been burning for so long it has become a local landmark. It borders, depending on which episode you are watching, Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky. These states do not share borders with each other. They are in different regions of the country. There is no geographical arrangement in which a single town could be adjacent to all of them simultaneously. Springfield has weather that ranges from full blizzard conditions to tropical heat waves within a single season. It is simultaneously on the coast and in the heartland. It is near the Canadian border and also near Mexico. Its area code when the show has shown one has corresponded to Missouri. Its state abbreviation when shown has been NT, which is not a real United States postal code. The show has been doing this on purpose since the beginning, not out of carelessness, out of deliberate, sustained, carefully maintained creative policy. Matt Groening, the show's creator, told Smithsonian Magazine in 2012 that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, and because he grew up near the Oregon town of that name. For approximately 48 hours, this felt like a resolution. Springfield was in Oregon. The mystery was solved. Except the show continued contradicting this immediately after the interview. Episodes aired after Groening's statement placed Springfield in geographic contexts that are definitively inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor the creator's revelation. They kept the ambiguity alive, continued the contradictions, and maintained the policy of making Springfield impossible to pin down. Because the ambiguity is the point. At the surface level, Springfield's geographic impossibility is an elegant piece of design philosophy. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone who watches. If Springfield is in Ohio, it is most immediately recognizable to people from the Midwest. If it is in Oregon, viewers from the Pacific Northwest have the strongest claim to it. By making it impossible to locate, the show ensures that every viewer experiences Springfield as potentially their Springfield. The industrial decay might be from a Rust Belt city they know. The suburban sprawl might be the development patterns of their own region. The small-town insularity might be from the community where they grew up. Springfield is everywhere because it was designed to feel like everywhere. This is the intentional artistic choice, confirmed by the show's creators, and it is a genuinely sophisticated one. But apply the theories we have been discussing tonight, and the geographic impossibility takes on additional dimensions. The radiation theory raises the possibility that Burns's contamination has not just affected the biology of Springfield's residents. If the show's world takes the contamination seriously as a physical force reshaping living things, there is a version of this theory in which the contamination reshapes space as well. The same energies that gave Blinky his third eye and extended Burns's lifespan through radiological means might also be responsible for the compression of geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into the immediate vicinity of a single town. Springfield exists in a space that does not obey the normal rules of American geography because the force at the center of it has been warping the rules since before anyone in Springfield started noticing. Under the coma theory, the geography makes even more immediate sense. Homer's dreaming brain does not contain a precise, accurate map of the United States. It contains impressions, fragments, emotional associations with specific landscapes. Mountains from a family vacation he half remembers. Ocean from a commercial that played on the hospital room television. Desert from a film. Farmland from a drive-through somewhere that might have been Illinois or might have been Kansas. The memory is imprecise. The dreaming brain assembled Springfield from every American landscape Homer ever encountered, layered without regard for the geographic logic that waking minds apply to the physical world. Because dreams do not have geographic logic, they have emotional logic. And emotionally, all of these landscapes belong to Springfield, because all of them are pieces of Homer's experience of America, assembled into the place that represents home. Under the collective denial framework, the town's refusal to have a fixed location serves a considerably more practical function. You cannot investigate a nuclear facility if you cannot establish jurisdiction. You cannot bring federal charges against an environmental violator if the state the violation occurred in keeps changing. You cannot hold anyone accountable for contaminating a water supply if the regulatory authority governing that supply shifts depending on which episode you are watching. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory oversight, no permanent state attorney general to investigate its three-eyed fish, no consistent EPA jurisdiction over its power plant. Burns benefits directly from Springfield's geographic uncertainty. It is the ultimate legal shield. The town floats between states because in any fixed location, someone would eventually show up with a badge and the authority to start asking questions. Floating means never having to answer those questions. In the Season 12 episode Behind the Laughter, a mockumentary format episode that treats the Simpson family as real people and the show as a documentary about them, Springfield's location is finally given a definitive answer. In the original broadcast, the family is described as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns of the same episode, the location was changed to a different state entirely. The answer to the most persistent question in the show's history depends on which version of the episode you happen to be watching on any given day. The show gave you the truth and then changed the truth based on the platform. Every state in the United States has been theorized as Springfield's home at some point by someone with enough evidence from within the show's canon to make the case. Every theory has supporting evidence and contradicting evidence. The ambiguity is not a puzzle with a solution. It is a feature, a deliberately constructed, continuously maintained state of permanent geographic uncertainty. A town that can be anywhere belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone cannot be shut down by anyone. You cannot seal something, you cannot locate, you cannot contain something with no fixed address. Springfield floats because it has to. Because landing would mean being found. And being found would mean being held accountable for everything we have spent this entire night discussing. The three-eyed fish, the cracked cooling towers, the skeletons in the basement, the man in the woods who glows in the dark, the baby who shot the billionaire, the principal who is not the principal, the water that nobody should be drinking. Springfield floats because some questions are safer when they have no fixed address. And the town has been floating for 36 years without landing, and without anyone in a position of authority caring enough to track it down. The most famous fictional town in American history has no location. Maybe that is the final joke, or maybe it is the final protection. There is a dimension to the Springfield geography question that connects it to the contamination theory in a way that is easy to miss, but that rewards attention. If the contamination from the plant spreads, and if Springfield can simultaneously border Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky depending on the episode, then the contamination originating from Springfield's plant is not a local problem. It is a regional problem that does not have a fixed location any more than Springfield itself has a fixed location. The contamination is, in a sense, as geographically impossible as the town, spreading through an impossible landscape in all directions, affecting geography that should not be adjacent, reaching environments that should be hundreds of miles apart. Under the contamination theory, Springfield's geographic impossibility is not just a comedy device. It is a description of the contamination's reach. The plant is not just poisoning one town. It is poisoning an impossible geography, a landscape that borrows from every American region and returns to every American region whatever the plant produces. There is also a regulatory dimension worth considering. You cannot regulate what you cannot locate. You cannot remediate what you cannot find. You cannot hold accountable a facility that sits simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions and therefore clearly in none. A facility or a town with a fluid and inconsistent geographic location sits outside all accountability structures, not because it has found a legal loophole, but because accountability requires location and location requires fixity. Springfield is not fixed. Springfield floats. And everything that might otherwise force accountability, the EPA, the state attorney general, the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Agency, the various oversight bodies that exist specifically to prevent the kind of thing that has been happening in Springfield for decades, all of them operate on the assumption that what they are regulating is somewhere definable. Springfield is not somewhere definable. It is everywhere and nowhere. And the jurisdictional apparatus designed to hold things like Burns's plant accountable cannot function in the face of an entity that refuses to be located. Burns did not create this geographic ambiguity, but he benefits from it more than anyone else in Springfield. And it is possible that Burns, who has spent over a century thinking about exactly these kinds of structural advantages, understood the value of Springfield's geographic ambiguity before he chose it as the location for his facility. You do not build a nuclear plant with 342 violations in a town that can be definitively located. You build it in Springfield. And then you keep it there for 36 years, while the fish develop extra eyes and the population develops yellow skin, and nobody from any fixed jurisdiction arrives to ask the questions that would make the whole arrangement visible. The fish have 3 eyes, the children have 4 fingers, the billionaire glows in the dark, and the town containing all of these things is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, floating between states like something designed specifically to exist between the lines of the regulatory maps that might otherwise force it to answer for itself. The question of where Springfield is can also be examined through the lens of what it would mean to definitely answer it, and why the show's creators have consistently refused to let an answer stick even when one has been offered. Matt Groening told the world that Springfield was based on Springfield, Oregon. He said it. It was reported. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery was considered solved. And then the show continued producing episodes that contradicted the Oregon setting, and the writers continued treating the location as unresolved, and the answer was unsolved almost as quickly as it was given. The writers' resistance to fixing the location is not creative stubbornness. It is institutional wisdom about what Springfield is and what it does. Springfield that is specifically in Oregon is Springfield that belongs to Oregon. Springfield that is simultaneously nowhere is Springfield that belongs to everyone who has ever lived in a Springfield, which is to say, everyone who has ever lived in an American town with a nuclear plant on its outskirts and a corrupt local politician and a school that is chronically underfunded and an economy that depends on a single employer that everyone knows is not quite as safe as it presents itself to be. That is not Oregon, that is not Kentucky, that is not Nevada or Ohio or Maine. That is every mid-sized American community that has ever made peace with an uncomfortable arrangement because the comfortable alternative was not available and the uncomfortable arrangement at least kept the lights on. Springfield must be everywhere because the situation it depicts must be recognizable everywhere. The moment it becomes specifically somewhere, the people who live in the other somewheres can relax. They can say that is Oregon's problem. That is not our plant. That is not our Burns. That is not our Homer. Springfield without a fixed location cannot be dismissed as someone else's problem. It is no one's specific problem, and therefore everyone's potential problem. It sits in the space between all possible American towns, familiar to all of them, belonging to none of them, unable to be externalized into the experience of a particular state. This is the deepest reason the location will never be fixed. Not legal protection from the EPA, not the comedy of geographic impossibility, not even the creative freedom that a universal setting provides. Springfield must be everywhere because the story of Springfield is the story of everywhere. And the moment you put it on a specific map, you let everyone who does not live on that specific map off the hook. The cracked cooling towers are not Oregon's problem. They are America's problem. They are the problem of every community that has ever decided the uncomfortable arrangement was preferable to no arrangement at all. And that problem belongs everywhere, which is exactly where Springfield is. Section 10, the floating timeline. The night is at its quietest now. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, let that quietness settle around you. We are coming to one of the last mysteries tonight, and it might be the one that sits closest to something true. Not about Springfield, about us. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now, in the year you are watching this. Lisa was 8 then and is 8 now. Maggie was 1 and is still 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s when the show began. They are still in their mid-30s. 36 years have passed in the world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. Every human being who watched the first episode of The Simpsons is 36 years older than they were then. Bart Simpson is the same age he was on the day they met him. He was 10 years old when people who are now in their 50s were children, and he will be 10 years old when the children of those children are watching the show, if the show continues long enough for that to happen. This is called a floating timeline. The present in the show is always the present for the viewer. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025, wearing 2025 clothes, making 2025 references, experiencing 2025 technology. When the show aired in 1995, the characters were in 1995. The year slides forward. The characters do not. Most audiences accept this without much friction because the alternative would make the show unmakeable. A serialized show with aging characters would eventually have to end. The children would grow up and leave home. The storylines that sustain the series would dissolve. And The Simpsons is not built to end. It is built to continue. So the floating timeline exists, and everyone agrees not to examine it too closely. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so large and so structurally strange that they have started to function as their own kind of evidence for something going wrong in Springfield. The most obvious problem is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their history was set in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. They fell in love. They had Bart. Their courtship was grounded in a specific cultural moment, complete with era-appropriate music, fashion, and reference points. Marge's prom dress, Homer's hair. The cultural context of their youth matched parents in their mid-30s during the late 1980s. But as the floating timeline dragged the present forward, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not meet in 1980. They met in approximately 2005, which means their adolescence was shaped not by Watergate and disco but by MySpace and early social media and the specific cultural texture of the early 2000s. The show has done this revision multiple times. Homer and Marge's origin story has been retold in flashback episodes set in different decades, each version updating their cultural references to maintain internal consistency with the floating present. They were grunge fans in one version, hipsters in another, early millennials in another. Their history is not a fixed past. It is a draft that gets rewritten whenever the timeline demands a new draft. This means Homer and Marge do not have a history. They have a series of approximations. Whatever backstory is needed to make the current episode function is the backstory they have for that episode. The old versions do not disappear because they are explicitly contradicted. They simply become part of the accumulated inconsistency that the show's audience has agreed not to examine. Now, run every theory through this and watch them all arrive at the same place. The coma theory. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993. The dreaming brain has no material beyond that final snapshot to work with. The children cannot grow up because the dreamer was not there to watch them grow. The history keeps shifting because the dreamer's memories are not fixed records, but reconstructions, assembled from fragments and emotional impressions that blur and shift the way memories always do in the minds of people who were not fully present for the events they are trying to recall. The radiation theory. Nobody ages because the contamination has altered the cellular biology of Springfield's residents at a level fundamental enough to affect the normal processes of biological aging. The floating timeline is not a narrative device. It is a symptom of what decades of radiation exposure has done to the physical matter of the people who live in this contaminated environment. The collective denial framework. Nobody acknowledges aging because acknowledging it would require acknowledging time passing. And time passing means consequences accumulating. It means the water has been contaminated for longer. It means Burns has been running the plant longer. It means the town has been failing to address these things for longer. Springfield does not age because aging is one more truth the town has voted to suppress. The Burns immortality theory. At least one person in Springfield has already demonstrated that the concept of aging is negotiable. If the wealthiest man in town has found a way to stay alive for over a century through the deliberate application of medical technology and economic resources, then the possibility space for what is and is not possible in Springfield's reality is already larger than the laws of biology normally allow. The floating timeline is strange, but it is not more strange than a man who has been alive since before the automobile was invented. All four theories say the same thing through different mechanisms. Time does not work correctly in Springfield. Something has disrupted the normal relationship between the passage of time and the experience of the people who live there. And the show's 36-year refusal to allow its characters to age is not a production convenience. It is evidence of that disruption. The show has imagined its characters aging. It has done this multiple times with real care and emotional intelligence. In the season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, the show depicts a future in which Lisa is 23, engaged to be married to a man she met at university, navigating adulthood with the particular combination of intelligence and emotional isolation that has always defined her. The future is detailed. The world around adult Lisa feels genuinely imagined rather than sketched. The episode is beautiful. And at the end of it, the future is locked away. Lisa returns to 8. Bart returns to 10. The glimpse through the window closes, and Springfield's permanent present resumes as though the vision never occurred. The show can imagine its characters growing up. It chooses, systematically and repeatedly, not to allow it. The official explanation is practical. Aging characters create continuity complications. A show running for decades cannot sustain serialized character development without eventually outrunning its premise. So the characters stay frozen, and the audience accepts the convention. But the show has been running long enough that this explanation starts to feel like it is describing something more than a production decision. The Simpsons is the American family in a way that no other television family has ever been. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as the show presents it, is not allowed to change. Homer must always be there in the morning, slightly damaged from whatever happened the previous episode, heading to a job he did not choose, loving a family he sometimes fails to understand but cannot imagine living without. Marge must always be the patient, intelligent, frequently frustrated center of the household, the person who keeps the structure standing when everything else is falling apart. Bart must always be the boy who is not bad but cannot stop reaching for the transgressive edge of every situation. Lisa must always be the one who sees clearly and is ignored for seeing clearly. Maggie must always be watching. The dynamic must be preserved. The structure must hold. Because the moment the Simpsons age, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves to a city where people finally understand her and Homer retires and Marge is left in an empty house on Evergreen Terrace, the show is no longer a comedy, it is an elegy. It is the story of something that ended, and we do not want that story. We never wanted that story. We wanted the version where nothing ends. The version where the kids are always young and the parents are always together and the house always looks the same and the couch gag always plays and the beer in Homer's hand is always cold and the credits always roll and everything goes back to where it was. The floating timeline is not the show's thesis statement about Springfield. It is the show's thesis statement about us. We pressed pause in 1989. We never pressed play. And so here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family live the same life in the same town, perfectly preserved, exactly as we left them, waiting for us every time we turn on the television. The loop is not their prison, it is ours. We built it, we maintain it. We tune in week after week to confirm that the walls are still holding and the family is still intact, and the world we loved when we first encountered it is still exactly where we left it. And every theory in this video, every mystery we have explored tonight, converges on this same point. Springfield is frozen because we need it to be. Because letting it change means admitting that we have changed, that we are older, that the world is different, that the couch we sat on when we first watched the opening credits might be gone now, or in someone else's house, or in a landfill somewhere outside of a city we used to live in. As long as The Simpsons is on, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling through the door at 5:30 with donuts, we do not have to fully confront any of that. Springfield is the place we go when we need things to be exactly as we remember them. And it will be there. It always is. The floating timeline has produced one practical consequence that is worth examining closely, which is the way it has made the show's flashback episodes increasingly unstable as the distance between the show's present and the historical anchors for the characters' backstories has grown. When The Simpsons began, Homer and Marge's backstory was anchored to the specific cultural moment of the late 1970s and early 1980s. This was simply accurate. If you are in your mid-30s in 1989, you were a teenager in the late 1970s. But the floating timeline has dragged the show's present forward through several decades, and the characters have remained in their mid-30s throughout, which means the arithmetic has broken in increasingly dramatic ways. The show has handled this by rewriting the backstory. Periodically, a flashback episode appears that retells the origin story with period-appropriate updates. Homer and Marge have been 70s teenagers, 80s teenagers, 90s teenagers, and, in the most recent iterations, something like 2000s teenagers. Each version is presented within its episode as the real version, the actual history of the family, and each version is then superseded by the next version when the arithmetic of the floating timeline requires another update. This means Homer and Marge do not have a history. They have a series of provisional histories, each one true for the season during which it appears, and then quietly retired when the next version becomes necessary. Their memories are not memories. They are the current best approximation of memories, subject to revision whenever the timeline demands it. Under the coma theory, this is one of the most direct expressions of what the dreaming mind can and cannot do. Homer's dreaming brain can generate the emotional content of the memories. It can produce the feeling of having been young with Marge, the feeling of the specific awkwardness and hope and tentative connection of falling in love for the first time. What it cannot do is anchor those feelings to a specific period with precision, because the dreaming brain does not have the resources to maintain both the emotional content and the historical precision simultaneously across the decades that the dream has been running. So the period details shift. The cultural references update. The specific anchors of when and where the memories happened change, because the dreaming brain is refreshing the simulation with whatever material is currently available, rather than whatever material was actually accurate at the time. Homer cannot dream the correct period for the backstory. He can only dream the backstory that his currently deteriorating brain can access. And as the brain deteriorates, as the temporal anchoring function erodes, the backstory becomes increasingly unmoored from any specific historical moment and increasingly floating, like the timeline itself, in a present that is always the present and a past that keeps reshaping itself to fit whatever the present requires. Homer cannot remember exactly when he was young. He can only remember that he was young with Marge and that it felt like this. And every time the show shows you a flashback, it is showing you that feeling, in whatever historical costume the current dream can dress it in, because the feeling is what Homer has managed to keep. The years he has lost, the feeling he kept. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind drift a little. You have been holding a lot of Springfield tonight. The theories are still there, patient and consistent, woven through everything the show has ever done. But right now, you can let them sit. You can let Springfield recede a little. Let Homer find his way home. The way he always does, the way the dream always makes sure he does. In the dream, the lights are always on at the house on Evergreen Terrace. There is a particular kind of grief that long-running shows produce in their audiences that is distinct from the grief produced by a show that ends. When a show ends, you know it is over. You can process the loss. You can grieve specifically and eventually move past it to something like acceptance. The show was there. The show is no longer there. The present tense becomes the past tense, and you adjust. The Simpsons does not end. It keeps going. And so the grief it produces is not the grief of loss, but the grief of distance. The grief of watching something continue that you experienced at an earlier and personally significant time, and that is still continuing now, as if the time between then and now has not fundamentally changed what you are and what you experience and what the show means to you. The show in 1995 was watched by a different person than the person watching it now. Both of them are you, in the genealogical sense. But the emotional and experiential distance between them is real and significant, and the show's willingness to continue as though that distance does not exist produces a specific effect. You are reminded, every time you watch, of the distance, of how much time has passed, of who you were when you first encountered this family, and who you are now encountering them again. The Simpsons does not produce nostalgia in the ordinary sense of yearning for a past that is definitively past. It produces something more complicated. Yearning for the past while the object of yearning is still present. The family is still there, the house is still there, Homer is still coming through the door, and you are the only one who has changed. This is what the floating timeline does to audiences over the long run. It makes time visible in the specific way that encountering something unchanged makes time visible. You look at Bart and you see 10 years old and you feel all the years that have passed since you were sitting somewhere watching Bart be 10 years old, and the feeling is not simple nostalgia. It is more precise. It is the feeling of your own impermanence, encountering something that insists on permanence. The Simpsons will outlive most of its current audience. It will still be there, Homer still at the console and Marge still patient and Bart still 10, when the people watching it now are gone. The show has already outlived some of its audience. It will continue to do so, and each generation that encounters it will have the same experience, the encounter with the family that does not change. The measurement of their own changed selves against that unchanging standard. The specific bittersweet feeling of watching the family that cannot age while you cannot stop aging. That feeling is not a side effect of the floating timeline. It is what the floating timeline produces. It is, in the deepest sense, what the floating timeline is for. Not production convenience. Not the lazy refusal to deal with the consequences of aging characters. The deliberate maintenance of a mirror that shows you yourself by showing you something else, something that stays still while you change around it. Homer will always find his way home, because that is what the dream requires, and because that is what we require when we sit down on a Sunday night and turn on the television and go back to Springfield one more time. The loop is ours as much as his. Section 11: Hans Moleman's Death Loop and the Darkness Behind Ned Flanders. We are near the end of tonight's journey through Springfield, and the town is settling into its quietest register now, the late-night hum of a place that never fully sleeps but grows more still in these hours. Before we close, there are two more mysteries that deserve their time, two more threads that the main theories left hanging. The first is about the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The second is about the nicest man in Springfield, and why that niceness might be the most tragic thing the show has ever depicted. Let us begin with Hans Moleman. If you have spent any time with The Simpsons, you know Hans Moleman. He is the tiny, nearly blind, seemingly ancient man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists, as the show has used him, primarily to suffer and die. He gets struck by vehicles, he gets crushed by falling objects, he gets buried alive by accident, he gets eaten by animals, he gets struck by lightning. He stumbles into dangerous situations with the docile acceptance of someone who has made peace with the universe's apparent interest in ending his life. By conservative count, Hans Moleman has died dozens of times in canonical episodes, not in Treehouse of Horror specials, which are explicitly non-canonical nightmare excursions into darker territory. Not in dream sequences or fantasy cutaways. In regular, ordinary Springfield episodes, Hans Moleman dies, and then returns in the next episode without explanation, fully reconstituted, ready to die again. The show treats this as a running gag. Moleman dies a lot. The audience recognizes the pattern. The pattern produces a kind of dark comedy in the repetition, and everyone moves on. Most fans have never spent any time asking the more serious question that Moleman raises. What is happening to Hans Moleman? Under the radiation theory, Moleman may represent the most extreme mutation Springfield has produced. A man whose biology has been so thoroughly rewritten by decades of nuclear exposure that his body has developed the capacity to reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. He does not survive his deaths the way Homer survives his injuries. Homer endures damage and heals through the kind of superhuman physical resilience we have discussed. Moleman actually dies. His body ceases to function and then restarts. Death in Springfield, for certain residents, may have become a temporary biological state rather than a permanent one. Under the coma theory, Moleman serves a more mechanical function. He is background infrastructure in Homer's dream, a minor character that Homer's unconscious mind does not care enough about to maintain with complete consistency. Homer's dreaming brain needs Springfield to feel populated, and so it generates figures to fill the background of scenes, and Moleman is one of them. Occasionally, the dream lets him lapse, lets him die, and then in the next scene reassembles him because the background needs its population density maintained. Moleman is not a person in this reading. He is furniture that the dream breaks and repairs as needed. Under the collective denial framework, Moleman's repeated deaths are simply one more thing Springfield has collectively agreed not to notice. A man dies publicly, visibly, in front of witnesses, and nobody asks how he keeps coming back. The town has normalized his death cycle the same way it has normalized everything else that should prompt urgent questions. Three-eyed fish, glowing billionaires, babies who shoot people, a principal who is not who he says he is, and a tiny old man who dies regularly and shows up again the following week. But here is the detail about Moleman that truly becomes strange when examined carefully. In one episode, Moleman states his age as 31. 31 years old. Look at him. He appears to be in his late 80s at minimum. Something has aged him catastrophically beyond his biological years. Something has taken a man who should be in the early prime of his adult life and compressed decades of physical deterioration into his appearance. Whatever has done this to him has also, apparently, made him difficult to kill in any permanent sense. Whatever altered his biological age forward may also have altered his relationship with mortality in a way that makes death a revolving door rather than a final exit. The radiation theory has an answer for this. The coma theory has an answer for this. The collective denial framework has an answer for this. The only framework that does not have an answer is the one that insists The Simpsons is just a cartoon, and Mulman dying a lot is just a running gag with no deeper significance. And now let us talk about Ned Flanders. Because Ned is the character the show has been quietly destroying more completely than any other. The darkness that the show has placed behind his relentless positivity is one of the most carefully constructed and most rarely discussed subtexts in the entire series. On the surface, Ned Flanders is Homer's opposite. Where Homer is irresponsible, Ned is meticulous. Where Homer is indifferent to religion, Ned is devout. Where Homer struggles with his temper, Ned is patient. Where Homer fumbles his finances, Ned is organized and solvent. Where Homer is a mediocre father, Ned is attentive and present and genuinely engaged with his sons' lives. Where Homer takes Marge for granted in ways that he is usually too limited to recognize, Ned loved his wife Maude with a visible and sincere tenderness. By any objective measure, Ned is the better man. The show makes this explicit. It does not hide the comparison. And then it destroys him, systematically, across the full run of the series, while the worst man next door stumbles through disasters and mostly survives them. Maude Flanders was killed by a stray t-shirt fired from a t-shirt cannon at a Springfield Speedway race. Homer was in the seat the cannon was aimed at. He ducked to pick up the hot dogs he had dropped. The t-shirts that would have hit him hit Maude instead. She fell from the bleachers. She died. Homer's thoughtlessness, his reflexive self-interest in a moment of no significance, killed Ned's wife. And Ned forgave him. Because that is what Ned does. Ned forgives. Ned turns the other cheek. Ned absorbs damage and responds with grace. Fans noticed the cracks in this grace long before the show explicitly examined them. And when it did examine them, the examination was devastating. A hurricane destroys Ned's house. The community comes together to rebuild it, which is the kind of collective effort that Springfield can produce when it is motivated. But the rebuild is so poorly executed that the reconstructed house collapses immediately, taking all of Springfield's good neighbor goodwill with it in a pile of lumber and bad joinery. And Ned snaps. He has a complete psychological breakdown in the middle of the neighborhood. He says things he has been holding for years, possibly for his entire life. He insults people who wronged him. He names the accumulation of damage that has been building beneath the surface of his patience. He says out loud what his normal behavioral presentation would never allow. And then he is institutionalized. He is committed to a mental health facility. And while he is there, the show reveals something about Ned that recontextualizes everything that came before. Ned was not always patient and gentle and relentlessly positive. As a child, Ned was violent, uncontrollable. His parents, who were beatniks philosophically opposed to conventional child-rearing methods, including discipline, did not know how to manage him. They took him to a psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist spent years conditioning the aggression out of Ned through a behavioral modification program so thorough that it effectively rewired his personality. Ned's niceness is not organic. It is installed. His patience is not a character trait he developed through practice and conviction. It is the output of a psychological system that was constructed inside him by an external authority when he was a child, without his consent, without his understanding, using methods that the show presents as having been effective, but also fundamentally violating of whoever Ned was naturally. The person Ned is supposed to be, the personality that would have developed without the intervention, is still in there. The show lets you see it in the hurricane scene. The moment the conditioning fails, the person underneath is not violent, though the show suggests the potential is present. The person underneath is someone carrying decades of suppressed rage and grief, and the specific pain of being the most virtuous person in a community that consistently suffers, while the less virtuous thrive. Ned does everything right. By every standard of moral behavior the show establishes, Ned is the person doing what a person should do. He is faithful, he is kind, he is responsible, he is present for his children, he is generous to his neighbors, including the neighbor who killed his wife without ever fully processing that he did so. And the show gives him nothing. His wife is dead, his house collapsed, his sons are fine but their lives are shadowed by loss that should not have happened. His faith is sincere and complete, but the God he believes in, the show has established clearly, does not communicate with Ned. God talks to Homer. Homer, who sleeps in church, who has had conversations directly with the divine on multiple occasions, who was told by God himself that his time was coming and that the meaning of life awaited him. Homer, who by any reasonable religious accounting should be the last person to receive divine communication. God ignores Ned, the man who has organized his entire life around his faith, who has sacrificed and struggled and forgiven in accordance with the principles his faith demands, gets silence. And the man who cannot remember which church he attends and who once set his own pew on fire gets a face-to-face conversation in his living room. That is the show's thesis statement about Ned. And it is not a comic thesis. It is one of the most honest and most painful observations the series has ever made. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Kindness is not protected. The system, whatever it is, radiation or coma or collective denial or institutional corruption or simple and brutal economic reality, does not calibrate its treatment of people according to their moral behavior. It calibrates according to compliance. And Ned is the most compliant man in Springfield, programmed into compliance before he was old enough to choose anything for himself. His reward is a dead wife and a collapsed house and a neighbor who will never fully understand what his selfishness cost, and a God who seems to be looking everywhere except at the pew where Ned is kneeling. Homer does everything wrong and survives everything. Ned does everything right and loses his wife to a stray t-shirt. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. And the gap between them has never once closed. Because the gap is not the result of their choices. The gap is the architecture of Springfield itself. The same architecture that keeps Homer at the plant and Burns at the top and Molman in the ground and Maggie behind her pacifier and the water contaminated and the fish three-eyed and the principal, not the principal, and the floating timeline floating and the coma dreaming and the mystery of who shot Mr. Burns officially closed but not actually solved. Springfield is not a comedy with dark edges. Springfield is a dark system that uses comedy as its coping mechanism. The jokes are real. The laughter is real, but underneath the laughter, underneath 36 seasons of Homer saying dough and Bart saying eat my shorts, and the family gathering on the couch before the credits run, underneath all of that is a town that has made peace with its own damage by agreeing not to look at it too closely. And we have been their audience for 36 years. We have watched the jokes and laughed at the gags and loved these characters, and returned to this town week after week for 3.5 decades. And maybe, without quite meaning to, we became Springfield ourselves. We normalized the yellow skin, we accepted the 4 fingers. We stopped asking why the fish had 3 eyes, and why the town never ages, and why the nicest man in town keeps losing, and why the richest man alive glows in the dark, and why Homer's children have been children for longer than most. Children's parents have been alive. We just accepted it, the way Springfield accepts everything. With a laugh and a shrug and the comfortable certainty that whatever it is, it will all be fine by next week. The theories exist because some people looked at Springfield and could not accept the surface. They dug. They asked the questions the characters cannot ask, because the characters are inside the loop and we are outside it. Or at least we were outside it once. But the loop has been running long enough now that the distinction between inside and outside has started to blur. We have become fluent in Springfield's language. We have internalized its logic. We can feel the narrative pull of the couch gag before it happens. We know how the reset works. We expect the recovery from the impossible. We are, in a way that would make the radiation theory very uncomfortable to contemplate, somewhat like the residents. Hans Mollmann's experience of death in Springfield is worth examining through the lens of each of the major theories, because he sits at the intersection of all of them in a way that illuminates what each theory is actually saying about the nature of Springfield's reality. Under the radiation theory, Mollmann represents the most extreme expression of what chronic nuclear contamination does to a biological organism. His body is so thoroughly altered by whatever the plant has done to it that it has lost the ordinary relationship between biological function and continuity of existence. Death, for Mollman, has become a temporary state. His cells reconstitute. His biological systems restart. The finality that death represents for every other organism does not apply to him in the same way. He stated his age as 31. If this is true, something has accelerated his visible aging to a degree that the contamination theory can explain, but that would be deeply alarming to anyone who stopped to examine it. He looks 60 years older than he is. The contamination aged his appearance while simultaneously making his body too resilient to actually die. He was made prematurely ancient and nearly indestructible by the same process. Under the collective denial theory, Mollman is the community's most public experiment in not seeing. He dies in front of witnesses. He dies in places where other characters are present and observing. He dies in situations where the appropriate response would be alarm, emergency services, some kind of institutional recognition that something has occurred that requires a response. And the response he receives from the community around him is nothing. Molman dying again is Springfield's version of a familiar local story, something everyone has seen before and learned not to register as requiring response. This is the specific horror particular to Molman's situation. He exists in a community that has learned to receive both his death and his survival as ordinary events. He dies in public, and nobody responds. He returns, and nobody comments on the return. The cycle continues, and he experiences it, as far as the show ever shows us his interiority, alone. Nobody in Springfield is tracking Molman's death count. Nobody has thought to ask whether someone who dies as frequently as Molman and comes back as reliably as Molman might represent evidence of something worth investigating. That absence of inquiry is, in miniature, the whole of Springfield. And for Ned, the darkness behind his relentless positivity is the darkness of someone who has been given all the information the situation contains and has correctly understood that the information leads nowhere useful. He has seen the three-eyed fish. He has watched the couch gag reset every week. He has lived next door to Homer for 36 years and watched Homer absorb every consequence without changing, watched the family endure and recover and endure again, watched the system continue regardless of what happens to the people inside it. Ned has enough intelligence and enough attentiveness to understand what he is looking at. What he does not have is the rage that would make that understanding actionable, because the rage was conditioned out of him before he was old enough to understand what was being taken from him. So he smiles. He forgives. He says neighborino. He feeds the poor and helps the helpless and keeps going to church on Sunday even though God is not there on Sunday. Not for him, not with anything to say. And behind all of that, behind the conditioning and the smile and the unfailing positivity, is a man who understands exactly what Springfield is, who has understood for a long time, who has understood in the specific painful way that comes from being intelligent enough to see clearly and too thoroughly conditioned to do anything with what you see. Every morning he gets up and he is kind to his neighbors anyway, not because he does not know, because the conditioning left him no other option. And that, in the end, is the darkest thing in Springfield. Not the contamination, not the coma, not the immortal billionaire, or the murderous infant, or the fake principal, or the floating geography. The man next door who has understood everything and whom the understanding has helped not at all. Ned Flanders, the last honest man in Springfield, smiling at Homer over the fence. Knowing, and going inside anyway. The show has given us one sustained look at what Ned Flanders' life looks like from Ned Flanders' perspective, and it is the hurricane episode. And it is devastating in the specific way that revelation is devastating when it confirms something you suspected but had not quite committed to believing. The hurricane destroys Ned's house. The community rebuilds it, in a famous sequence, poorly, with volunteer enthusiasm that outpaces volunteer competence, and the rebuilt house collapses almost immediately. And Ned, standing in front of the collapsed house, that the community that has been the center of his life and his faith and his sustained daily practice of goodness has built him, breaks. He does not break in the way that people in action movies break. He does not produce something operatically dramatic. He produces something much worse. He stands there and he begins, calmly and methodically, to tell everyone around him what he actually thinks of them. He names the things they have done, the ways they have failed him, the gap between what they present to the world and what they actually are. He says it quietly, with precision, the way a person who has been keeping very careful track for a very long time finally produces the accounting that the keeping has been building toward. And then he is institutionalized. He goes to a facility and he is treated by a psychiatrist who was himself driven mad by treating him, and the psychiatrist's intervention succeeds, and Ned comes back, and he is kind again, and Springfield accepts him back, and the hurricane and the breakdown and the accounting are filed away in the same drawer where Springfield files everything it does not want to examine. But the psychiatrist's revelation about the childhood conditioning stays. The information that Ned's kindness is the product of deliberate behavioral modification, that the aggression it replaced was real and substantial, that the cage was built by a specific intervention rather than grown from Ned's natural character, that information is in the canonical record, and it changes everything that came before and after it. Every moment of Ned's patience is now visible as the operation of a psychological system rather than the natural expression of a personality. Every act of forgiveness is the programmed response of someone who was specifically trained to produce it when rage would be the natural response. Every blessing, every diddly, every neighborino is the output of a system that was installed in a child before he was old enough to consent to it. Ned cannot be angry. He was conditioned not to be. And the situations in his life, the dead wife, the collapsed house, the neighbor who will never fully see him, these are situations that should produce anger. That would produce anger in a person whose emotional range had not been specifically constrained. That do produce anger in Ned, somewhere under the conditioning, the anger that emerged during the hurricane and that was immediately treated and suppressed and returned to its compartment. The conditioning holds, it always holds, and Ned smiles, and says neighborino, and goes to church, and waits for the God who speaks to Homer to, perhaps, one day have something to say to him. He is still waiting. He will continue to wait. The loop does not resolve for Ned any more than it resolves for anyone else in Springfield. He is the kindest person in the loop, and the loop does not reward kindness. That is Springfield. That has always been Springfield. That will always be Springfield. And somehow, knowing this, you will watch it anyway. Because the loop is not punishment. It is the version of things that refuses to end. And refusing to end, in the specific way that Springfield refuses to end, is its own strange form of grace. Good night. Closing. We have traveled a long way through Springfield tonight. We started with the contamination, with the three-eyed fish, and the cracked cooling towers, and the 342 violations, and the man whose job was to prevent all of this, and who was chosen specifically because he could not. We followed the evidence of what living downstream from a broken nuclear plant does to the bodies and minds of the people who live downstream from it. And we found that the evidence had been in the show since season 2, visible to anyone who looked directly at it rather than through it. We moved into the coma and found a different kind of darkness, the darkness of a man who went somewhere he could not come back from, and who has been dreaming his family back to him ever since. The dream is not a nightmare. It never was. The dream is the only heaven that Homer Simpson would have designed for himself, a house on Evergreen Terrace where nobody ages and the beer is cold and the couch is always there. We reopened the shooting and found that the official case has more holes in it than the show wants to acknowledge, that the contest nobody won was the clearest sign that the solvable mystery was not as solvable as advertised, that Burns's "It's You" is a detail the show dropped into the scene and then never properly accounted for. We traced Burns's impossible lifespan through the medical infrastructure that sustains it, through the weekly treatments and the disease equilibrium and the Smithers dependency and the century of accumulated wealth that has been pointed in every dimension of its operation at the single goal of keeping Burns alive and functional and in control. We sat with Maggie in her silence and understood that the silence was never absence. It was strategy. It was the product of watching her sister fight for recognition and receive none, and deciding that the better approach was to become invisible and accomplish things below the threshold of anyone's attention. We watched Springfield vote to criminalize truth and exile the real Seymour Skinner on a train, and we recognized in that vote not a cartoon absurdity, but the formalized version of a mechanism that every community uses and that most communities have the good grace to leave informal. We followed Mona Simpson's trail from a suburban Springfield living room in 1969 to 27 years of being a fugitive because she stopped to help an injured man who turned out to be the man whose weapons she was destroying. We examined the predictions and found the real explanation underneath the mythology of prophecy, not prophecy, diagnosis. 36 years of reading the present more carefully than most people bring to their own lives, and finding that the future, when it arrives, often looks like something the show has already described. We searched for Springfield and found it everywhere and nowhere. We examined the floating timeline and found at the end of it a thesis statement about what the American family means in the cultural imagination and why it is necessary for it to be eternal. We looked at Hans Moleman dying and coming back in the background of a town that has normalized his death cycle. We sat with Ned Flanders and understood that his tragedy is not that he is good in a world that is not good to him, but that he knows this clearly and smiles anyway. This is Springfield, not the version that exists on the surface, though that version is also real and also worthwhile and has given 36 years of people, 36 years of reasons to watch and to love and to come back. The surface version is genuinely joyful and genuinely warm in the particular way that a show about a family that keeps choosing each other despite everything is warm. But underneath it, patient and persistent, is this other version. The one where the yellow skin is not an art choice and the four fingers are not a shorthand and the cracked cooling towers are not background detail. The one where Homer's stupidity is a wound, where Maggie's silence is a strategy, where Burns's immortality is a system, where Springfield's amnesia is a policy. The one where everything that seems absurd about the show turns out, under examination, to be evidence of something coherent and something troubling, and something that the show has been trying to show you in the only register available to it, which is comedy, for 36 years. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy, threading through every episode, accumulating across every season, building a picture that becomes undeniable if you look at it from far enough away, is a story about a family that was systematically damaged by a system that needed them damaged. About a community that has been slowly poisoned by the facility it depends on. About the mechanisms by which power perpetuates itself through the impairment of the people it exploits. About the ways communities choose comfortable fictions over uncomfortable truths. About what it costs to be Ned Flanders. About what it means that Maggie is still watching, still waiting, still planning whatever it is she has been planning for 36 years. Tonight you looked underneath. And whatever you find when you go back to watching the show after this, whatever you see now that you did not see before, it will be there. Let the sounds of the episode fade. Let Springfield recede. Let your mind carry whatever piece of this it needs into whatever sleep is coming. Homer will be at the console when you wake up. The plant will still be running. Burns will have had his weekly treatment. Maggie will be watching. Ned will be smiling. Some things in Springfield never change. The most honest thing The Simpsons ever did was run for 36 years without resolving anything. Not because the writers could not think of resolutions, because resolution was never the point. The point was always the running, the continuation, the weekly return to the couch and the family and the town that cannot change because changing would mean something ending, and something ending would mean admitting that the time we spent with Springfield is time we will not get back. Springfield did not age. We did. And every time we visit, we measure that distance. The distance between who we were when we first watched and who we are now. That distance is what Springfield is made of. It is the distance between every viewer and their own lost version of the life The Simpsons represent. The uncomplicated family, the house that does not change, the children who are always children, the parents who are always together, the town that is always there. We cannot get it back. We never could. It was not real when we first encountered it, and it is not real now. But it felt like something. It felt like the shape of what we were hoping for. And shapes like that do not leave when you stop watching. Springfield is still there. It will always be there. In the dream, the lights are always on. There is a thread that runs through all of these theories that has not been named directly yet, and that is worth naming before we close. Every theory we have examined tonight arrives at the same structural conclusion through a different path. The contamination theory says that a community has been systematically harmed by the industrial facility at its center, and that the harm has been sustained across decades through the active choices of the facility's owner and the passive acceptance of the community that cannot clearly perceive the harm because the harm has damaged their capacity for perception. The coma theory says that the world we are watching has been generated by a single consciousness that is cut off from the real world, and that the disconnect between the dream and reality is permanent and growing. The shooting theory says that the official answer to the town's most significant criminal event is not the true answer, and that the true answer has been protected by the same institutional forces that protect every uncomfortable truth. In Springfield, the immortality theory says that one person in the community has found a way to exist beyond the normal constraints that govern everyone else's existence and has used that exemption to extend indefinitely the arrangement from which he benefits most. The Tamsarian theory says that the community made a formal and explicit choice to maintain a fiction over a truth and expelled the truth from the community to ensure the fiction's survival. The Mona Simpson theory says that the suffering of the Simpson family across 3 generations was not accidental, but was the direct consequence of one man's decision to pursue a personal grudge against the person who tried to hold him accountable. The predictions theory says that the show has been accurately describing real dynamics in American life for so long that the description looks like prophecy from the outside. The geography theory says that the community's inability to be located is the same as its inability to be held accountable. The floating timeline theory says that the community exists in a permanent present tense that is maintained by the collective will of an audience that cannot bear to let the family age. All of these theories are saying that something is wrong in Springfield that is not an accident. The contamination is not accidental. It is the product of deliberate choices made by a person with more power than anyone else in the community, and therefore more power than anyone else to make and sustain those choices. The cognitive impairment is not accidental. It is the downstream consequence of contamination that was allowed to continue because addressing it would have required accountability that the person responsible for it was powerful enough to prevent. The institutional capture is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of a century of investment by the most powerful entity in the community into every institution that might otherwise challenge that power. The amnesia is not accidental. It is the functional adaptation of a community that has learned, through generations of failing to change its situation, that remembering is more painful than forgetting, and that the comfortable arrangement, however damaged it makes them, is preferable to the uncertain and painful process of trying to replace it. Springfield is a system, not just a setting. A system with inputs and outputs and feedback loops and equilibrium states that resist perturbation. Burns is the system's organizing intelligence, the person whose resources and will and century of accumulated strategic advantage maintain the system's equilibrium against every force that might disturb it. Homer is the system's key node, the person whose specific incapacitation ensures that the system's most critical vulnerability, the safety inspector of its most dangerous facility, provides protection rather than oversight. Smithers is the system's maintenance infrastructure, the person whose devotion ensures that the system's organizing intelligence survives the biological vulnerabilities that would otherwise end it. Maggie is the system's unknown variable, the element whose nature has not been fully revealed, whose capacity exceeds what the system has accounted for, whose eventual action the system has not planned for. Lisa is the system's conscience, the part of the system that knows what the system is and cannot stop knowing and cannot make the knowing stop hurting. Lisa is what happens when the damage is not comprehensive, when the individual's capacity for clear perception survives despite the environment's consistent effort to compromise it. She is 8 years old, and she has been 8 years old for 36 years, and she has been in pain for all of it, the specific pain of seeing clearly in an environment that rewards not seeing, of being right in a community that punishes rightness, of caring about things in a world that is organized around caring about nothing that would require the arrangement to change. Lisa is the show's truest argument, not the contamination, not the coma, not the shooting or the immortality or the impossible geography or the frozen timeline. Lisa, the 8-year-old who keeps looking even though looking has never produced the outcome that looking is supposed to produce. Who keeps raising her hand even though the hand never produces the recognition that raising it should produce. Who keeps being right in a world that ignores rightness and keeps caring, in a world that punishes caring, and keeps being herself in a place that would be significantly more comfortable if she were someone else. Lisa is what you are when you are paying attention to the right things, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you cannot stop. She is the viewer inside the show. The person watching Springfield and seeing it clearly, and being unable to look away, and being unable to make anyone else see what she sees and continuing anyway. She is 8. She will always be 8. And she will never stop looking. That is the final mystery of The Simpsons. Not who shot Burns, not where Springfield is, not how Burns has lived for over a century, not whether Homer woke up in April of 1993. The final mystery is Lisa, the person who sees everything and changes nothing and continues anyway. The show's most honest acknowledgement that clear sight is not enough, that rightness is not protection, that caring about the right things in the wrong system does not change the system, that you can be correct about everything and still be 8 years old for 36 years with nobody quite listening, and yet she keeps playing her saxophone. In the dark, in the window, she keeps playing, because the alternatives are worse. Because stopping looking would be more painful than continuing to see. Because the music is hers even if nothing else is. Because in the loop that does not break and the timeline that does not move and the system that does not change, there is still the saxophone in the window and the girl playing it, and the song she is playing to whatever part of the world is still listening. That is Springfield. That is all of it. The contamination and the coma and the mystery and the immortality and the silence and the denial and the conspiracy and the predictions and the geography and the frozen time and the death that keeps cycling and the kindness that goes unanswered. And underneath all of it, in the yellow house on the yellow street in the impossible town, a girl playing saxophone in the window because the song is true even if nothing else is. Good night, Springfield. Good night. Good night. The loop does not break. That is the final truth of Springfield. Every theory we have examined tonight describes a different reason why it does not break, a different mechanism by which the continuation is maintained, a different force, ensuring that Homer wakes up tomorrow and goes back to the plant, and that Marge is patient, and that Bart is still mischievous, and that Lisa is still playing her saxophone in the window, and that Maggie is still watching. Everything from behind the pacifier. But they all agree on the same fact. The loop continues. It has always continued. It will continue after this night ends, and after you have carried whatever you carry from this into sleep, and after the morning comes, and the ordinary day reasserts itself. Springfield is still there. The plant is still running. The fish in the river still have 3 eyes. And Homer, wherever Homer actually is still dreaming, still coming home. The lights on Evergreen Terrace are always on. They have been on since December of 1989, and they will be on when you wake up tomorrow. Some things in Springfield do not change. The family does not change. The love that holds the family together does not change. Whatever else the contamination has taken, whatever the coma has sealed away, whatever the system has damaged in its long operation, the love is still there, visible in every episode, threaded through everything. Homer loves his family. That is the loop's center. That is what it is made of. That is what holds. Good night.